Confessions of a Bibliomaniac, Books, Cults, Evolution, and Skepticism. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by John Longen. Chapter 1. A Short History of My Book Addiction. I suffer from a most incurable disease. It is technically known as bibliomania, which simply translated means book madness. I love books too much. My family is convinced I got it from my father, Warren, who also suffered from it, but to a lesser degree. However, the malady didn't really mutate and take over my body until I was 16 or so. That was because I happened upon a unique bookstore in West Hollywood called the Bodhi Tree. Situated on Melrose Avenue near La Cienega, the Bodhi Tree housed a most remarkable collection of books on philosophy and Eastern religions. It was also one of the only bookstores that had chairs, and the proprietors didn't mind if customers sat for a spell and read their books. They even offered you a free cup of tea. I used to go there almost daily during high school. It was about 20 or so minutes from my house, and I have very fond memories of driving over Laurel Canyon from the valley and making the pilgrimage, never quite certain what I would discover. I even took dates there, and on occasion would lose dates there as well, so absorbed I would be with a book or two. Although I didn't have much money, whatever I did save I spent on books, particularly if something caught my eye. I remember when I was 18 years old and spending $80 for the 4-volume leather-bound English translation of the Sikhs' Holy Scriptures, Guru Granth Sahib, as translated by Kapal Singh. 42 years later, I am still a proud owner of it. Sometimes I would even go to the Bodhi Tree twice a day. Such was my addiction to the place. I usually coupled those drives with a lunch at the Source restaurant on Sunset Boulevard, famous for its owner and cult leader, Father Yod. Or my favorite one, the Golden Temple Conscious Cookery on 3rd Avenue, inspired by Yogi Bhajan, who also happened to be Father Yod's one-time guru, and which featured a wickedly good vegetarian chili. Sadly, the Bodhi Tree, though it became exceedingly popular in the mid-1980s after Shirley MacLaine wrote about it in her reincarnation-tinged tome, Out on a Limb, closed down several years ago. The place still haunts my dreams as I find myself walking on its creaky wooden floors, looking for buried treasures on its old-school bookshelves. Having been there literally hundreds of times before I reached the age of 19, and before I got more serious in my undergraduate studies, a few literary gems stand out, particularly when I hadn't known about the book before, The Book of Merdad by Mikhail Naimi. I think I read that in just one sitting, even resisting a bathroom break. A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. I was so enthralled that I ended up writing the author a letter to which he kindly replied, something that I later learned was not his habit. Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. This gem was something I went back to and read repeatedly. I even read it almost monthly still. But the books that stood out the most for me during those initiatory days were those by the Sufi mystics, Rumi and Hafiz. I read their translated poems over and over again. I became so enamored with them that I purchased a complete 3-volume set of Rumi's Mansavi, and as a special birthday gift I was given a rare edition, only 500 were printed, of the Divan of Hafiz. Bodhi Tree was a religious ritual for me, and every time I went there I would invariably touch my hand to the wind chimes just outside the entrance. After which I would peruse the new book table and the new magazines on display. Then I would go to my usual haunts in the Eastern philosophy section and settle in for several hours with a favorite mystic. The bookstore also attracted a fair number of crackpots and celebrities. One night, an older woman tried to hook up with me, explaining that she saw an aura around me that indicated that we still had unresolved karma. I'd never seen the woman in my life, and I somehow managed to deflect the conversation to the current book I was reading at the time. Paul Twitchell's partly plagiarized but nevertheless enjoyable journey about being out of body called The Tiger's Fang. Then, given just the right moment, escaped into the bathroom, which was adjacent to the office where the owners Stan and Phil did their orders. The bathroom always had some beautiful incense lit, which permeated one's clothes even hours after leaving, reminding one anew that the typographically charged mistress was awaiting your return. As for celebrities, I remember sitting near the entrance when a strikingly handsome man came up to me and asked where the Buddhism section was. He was particularly interested in Tibetan Buddhism. Since I knew the bookstore better than I knew my own face, I led him to several books about the Dalai Lama. I learned a few moments later that it was the actor Richard Gere. In the early 1970s, the bookstore during the week would be relatively empty, and I found myself hanging out with the store's resident cat, a very friendly little fellow. It was so quiet sometimes that I used to have to ring a bell on the counter to get the cashier. One time when I was there, this older man looking like he just came from the Newport Beach Tennis Club, dressed as he was in a pink sweater with a white polo shirt with the collar turned up and neatly pressed slacks, started talking very loudly and pointing at all the guru pictures that were plastered on the walls in the bookstore. He was carrying on, saying that he knew this teacher and that master and this lama, etc. Once he glanced over at me and I immediately recognized him as Timothy Leary, the infamous professor from Harvard who had gotten kicked out along with Richard Albert for his drug experiments with undergraduates. I didn't know then that one of the reasons he got booted was because of a young future doctor, Andrew Weil, who wrote an expose of sorts about Leary's and Albert's activities. Of course, Dr. Weil himself would become famous later for his New Age books on health and diet. Many of Weil's later books were also featured at the Bodhi Tree. Since the bookstore was really just an old Hollywood house transformed, it was decided that it needed more space and thus was remodeled, adding a second floor, though only workers were allowed there. While it certainly added more space to the place, it lost a bit of its charm in the process. The best thing that happened, however, was when they added a used bookstore in the back of the new store in the parking driveway. The used book section, though less frequented, some customers, to my chagrin, never knew it existed, became my favorite since the prices were very reasonable and could allow me to buy more books. As much as I loved the Bodhi Tree, I ventured out to other bookstores as well, including a few that were in sketchier neighborhoods. One place in particular served me well for finding obscure texts. This was Book City in North Hollywood. Here I found a first edition of Julian P. Johnson's autobiography, Call of the East, a rare find since only 1,000 were printed and it has never been reissued. I also bought his other pseudo-autobiography of his wife, Elizabeth Bruce, entitled The Unquenchable Flame. I say pseudo here because it is purported to be her autobiography, even though it was written, without irony, by her new husband, Julian Johnson, who had first met her in India at the Radhaswami Center in Dayalbagh, Agra, in the early 1930s. I also discovered the polemic yet historically invaluable books of S.D. Maheshwari, who I would later personally interview with Professor Mark Juergensmeyer at Swami Bagh, Uttar Pradesh, in the summer of 1978. My love of books took a huge leap forward when I went to get my M.A. in Berkeley and got access to the majestic UC Berkeley Library with over 10 million volumes. Having graduate privileges, I used to roam the floors for hours. I would spend upwards of 10 hours just getting lost with all the titles, sometimes sitting on the floor, lost in enchanted worlds. One time, late in the day in a remote corner, I was startled to see an old man hunched over a tiny steno-like stove, making himself lunch with a large pile of books around him. Apparently walking down to Telegraph Avenue for food would have taken too much time away from his precious texts. I asked him how long he was there, and he said he came every day as long as he could, sometimes trying to hide after closing hours. I understood his addiction too well, as once I got so absorbed by Carl Sagan's Dragons of Eden at the Hayward Public Library in the late 1970s that I lost all track of time. I was sitting in a bean chair, and as I got up, I noticed that no one was around. I was all alone, and the lights had been dimmed. As I tried to leave, I noticed that the door was bolted. I was locked inside the library. Thankfully, a custodian came in a few minutes later and provided me with a swift exit. I loved Berkeley's numerous bookstores on Telegraph Avenue. I would roam from Moe's to Cody's to Shambhala. Of course, I had no money, so I had to spend most of my time standing and reading, but it was a delight all the same. Later, when I went for my Ph.D. at the University of California, San Diego, I found myself ensconced in the vast spaceship library that jutted from the ground and looked like it was ready for blastoff. The only glitch was that the Geisel Library, as it is now named in honor of Theodore Seuss Geisel, who donated a huge sum and who is more well known as Dr. Seuss, didn't have all the books I needed. The UCLA Library had a much better collection in philosophy, particularly in Asian studies, so each week I would take the interlibrary bus up to Los Angeles and hang out at UCLA for 6 or so hours, making sure to take out at least 20 or so books that I desperately needed. Sometimes the library bus was so full of books, since it was the vehicle of choice for interlibrary loans, that I would have to sit on 100 or so books instead of a seat. While my family is all avid readers, they are not as compulsive as I am about books and their creation. The only friend that understood my addiction and shared my deep love of them was Jeff Cooper, who I first met in high school. He likes to tell the story that whenever we would meet in the bathroom at Notre Dame High School, he would invariably check out which books I was currently reading. He distinctly remembered when I was carrying around the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Jeff was a connoisseur of how a book was put together, the binding, the paper, the dust jacket, and even the smell. My other friend who loved books, but more for the content than for their housing, was Joseph Maria, who always seemed to be on the cutting edge of what was on offer. Joseph was particularly adept at making friends with literary stars. I fondly recall how he became acquainted with Aldous Huxley's widow, Laura, and used to visit her periodically at her Hollywood Hills home. Joseph was only 16 at the time. He was also a big fan of Krishnamurti. One of the great highlights of my book collecting happened in the winter of 1987 when I was awarded an OGSR travel grant to collect rare books on the Sant and Radhaswami tradition in North India. Going to obscure bookstores and ashrams in Delhi was fascinating, especially when I secured a hard-to-find book. Though I pride myself at being fairly obsessive about all things book-related, I must admit that there are others who make me look quite amateurish in comparison. A master bibliophile is Dr. J. Gordon Melton, founder of the Institute of American Religion, who is currently Distinguished Professor of American Religious History at Baylor University. Professor Melton came to visit me at my office at the University of California, San Diego, where I was teaching in Warren College. This was back in the mid-1980s, and I had offered to give Dr. Melton some of my rarer books for his growing collection on new religions at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he had amassed over 31,000 books, pamphlets, and other ephemera during the past 20 years or so. We had just come from dinner with another noted academic, Andrew Rawlinson, well known for his Book of Enlightened Masters, and more recently, The Hit, in downtown San Diego, and our conversation ranged from Aleister Crowley and occult literature to the Dallas Cowboys football team. When Dr. Melton looked at some of the rare bibliographic items I had on offer and realized that they were his for the asking, I think I noticed a slight panting in his breath where his level of excitement had to be modified by unconscious yogic pranayama. Simply put, Melton looked like an overly stoked surfer getting ready for an epic session at Snapper Rock in Australia. Books were and are for Melton, as they are for me, magic objects of utter delight. My obsessive book collecting, however, didn't go stratospheric until we bought a second home in La Quinta, California. Our Huntington Beach house was simply too small to contain more than 1,000 books or so. While it is certainly true, since I got tenured as a professor of philosophy back in 1991, that I started buying books at an accelerating rate, I could not properly store them, and thus they were scattered in my garage and completely maxed out in my renovated office at Mount San Antonio College, where I had to have specially built bookshelves to fit the curved walls within the confined space. At one time, I even had to rent 2 storage units to keep the ever-growing library from overflowing into the streets. The most dramatic change in my collecting habits happened when I discovered that various libraries were opening up used bookshops to garner more income. After the introduction of Amazon's Kindle in 2007 and Apple's iPad in 2010, a large number of erstwhile paperback and hardback readers opted for the digital screen. Today, the vast majority of my younger students prefer to read off their smartphones or tablets. Thus, many people started donating their books to libraries since they had become more or less cumbersome furniture. For the past 10 years, I have been visiting numerous libraries and finding a vast number of hidden treasures. Right now is the golden age for bibliomania, particularly since the price of used books has gotten downright cheap. I guesstimate that I go to bookstores and libraries 5 times a week, buying on average anywhere from 4 to 12 books each trip. Sometimes I hit the mother lode and almost cannot carry out what I have purchased, and rarely do I leave empty-handed. I have one rule that I follow when I buy a book. I must really want to read it, even if only partially. I simply refuse to buy any text that doesn't in some way interest me. I have a deep fondness for science, so the majority of my library has something to do with quantum theory, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and so on. I also love finding arcane books on Eastern philosophy and religion. My eyes tend to light up whenever I can buy an art book filled with color pictures of Tibetan Buddhist art or the exquisite portraits of Hindu gods and avatars. I almost never buy fiction, with some exceptions for Jorge Borges, Marcel Proust, Somerset Maugham, James Hilton, and my all-time favorite, Leo Tolstoy. My kids and I suspect that we now have over 17,000 books of various shapes and sizes. The vast majority of these are in 5 distinct rooms in our house in the desert. My wife teases me that the real reason we bought the second home was not for vocational respite, but for final resting place for all things typographical and pictorial. Since I have personally selected each book in the library, I feel a sense of intimacy wherever I look, as each title beckons me to spend more time within their seductive covers. Books are voyages. Books are flights. Books are imaginary worlds, and even if one never leaves the comfort of one's armchair, a book can immediately transport its reader to unexplored lands and vistas. I find myself traveling daily along unknown routes, hidden byways, and unseen heights. I love surfing informational oceans, and I have become accustomed to spending huge chunks of time in the cerebral hemispheres, where our consciousness, with just a little prodding from algorithmic sequences of 26 letters or patterned numbers, can stimulate and enliven the most fantastic characters amid wondrous landscapes. Yes, I am a book addict, but alas, I am a very happy one, always on the quest, always in search of that untouched horizon. Chapter 2. Studying Cults. A 40-Year Reflection. Several months ago, I was asked to complete a questionnaire about my decades-long research into cults, or what are more properly known today as religious movements. I have decided to slightly edit it for publication by minimizing the questions that were asked, since the responses to varying queries tended to flow into one another. The following is my edited version of the same. Introduction. For the first 20 or so years of my career, I concentrated on the study of relatively new religions in India and their impact on cults in North America and elsewhere. My first book was actually completed when I was 20, and over the next couple of years after that, I added significantly to it. It started out as a term paper on Ekankar, but quickly evolved into a much longer study entitled The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Ekankar. This caused a major stir in the movement, and it has been widely cited for the past 4 decades, primarily because the book claimed that the founder of Ekankar had plagiarized many of his sacred writings and had lied about his past. After this, I co-founded a journal with Brian Walsh called Understanding Cults and Spiritual Movements, which was published over the span of 4 years. We did critical studies on John Roger Hinkins and the movement of spiritual inner awareness, Adida, and Satya Sai Baba, among others. It generated a lot of controversy, and at one point my life and others associated with me were threatened by John Roger Hinkins, who eventually robbed my home in Del Mar, California. Peter McWilliams' famous book, Life 102, What to Do When Your Guru Sues You, has an entire chapter devoted to how John Roger orchestrated a smear campaign against me and other researchers. I did my M.A. and Ph.D. on the history of the Radhaswami, which eventually led to my book, The Radhaswami Tradition, A Critical History of Guru Succession. Several of my critical articles on cults were published in a library volume entitled Exposing Cults, When the Skeptical Mind Confronts the Mystical. After securing my Ph.D., my focus changed and I became interested in studying quantum theory, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. I was particularly interested in understanding the material basis behind consciousness. I have written a large number of articles and essays on this subject for Integral World. Several books have also been published, including Is the Universe an App?, Adventures in Science, and The Feynman Imperative, among others. I also became interested in making films when I first started teaching upper division courses on science and religion at California State University, Long Beach. This has resulted in over 100 short films on such subjects as the Einstein-Bohr debate over the implications of quantum theory, the future of artificial intelligence in the classroom, and a neurological explanation behind near-death experiences. Currently, I am in the process of finishing up a large book entitled The Library of Consciousness. The definition of a cult. The standard definition for cult is a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. In this context, almost anything can be taken as a cult, particularly if we define religion, as Paul Tillich has, as anything for which we have ultimate concern. However, the more popular usage of cult is what we see in the mainstream press for any group that is not traditional and displays aberrant behavior from the norm. Today in religious studies, scholars tend not to use the term cult, but instead use the all-purpose term new religious movements. My own view is that every religion or ism can be regarded as potentially cultic if we use the pejorative usage of that term. Even a sport like surfing can have a cult-like following, or a charismatic leader in politics can be seen as cultic. It all depends on how we are using the term. Today in the mass media, it has become a buzzword for anything bizarre. Why so many cults in California? Yes, I think it is not surprising that California, given its population of nearly 40 million inhabitants and its wide ethnic diversity, does indeed have a disproportionate number of cults or new religious movements. Several factors contribute to this, not the least of which is its location on the Pacific Rim and the influx of new arrivals from various countries around the world. For instance, the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, set into law by then-President Lyndon Johnson, had a dramatic impact on allowing many more Indians to migrate into this country. These Indians brought with them their culture, their cuisine, their clothes, and perhaps most importantly, their religion. San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, being seaports and key entry points into the United States, became a haven for a large influx of highly educated Indians, Chinese, Africans, Indonesians, and others. Los Angeles, in particular, has often been regarded as the Benares of America, since there are so many different faiths that have established centers there. Thus, it isn't an exaggeration to say that California has more than the lion's share of alternative religions as well as alternative lifestyles. Besides the obvious economic and political incentives that draw so many to California, there is also a greater tolerance for different faiths and different viewpoints. Some scholars argue that any large seaport are by their very existence more open to an influx of new ideas, including religious ones, since it must cater to accepting any and all nationalities, even if some of them may at first seem strange or unusual, including the influence of Paramahansa Yogananda and his organization Self-Realization Fellowship has had throughout Southern California. Eckankar started in California, and other groups have blossomed here, including L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology and Swami Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada's Krishna Consciousness. The attraction of cults. It is wrong to think that only a certain set of individuals are attracted to cults. The truth is more complex. Potentially anyone can be susceptible to new religious movements and/or certain cult leaders. What we've discovered is that there isn't just one type of person who joins these groups. Rather, it all depends on the time, the place, and precisely what a person is looking for or what they feel they lack. Cults vary in how they recruit new members. I have long noticed that Christian evangelicals are very fond of trying to gather new followers by preaching on college campuses. They do this by handing out literature, usually the New Testament in paperback, or inviting undergraduates to an informal dinner or Bible study. The Hare Krishnas were famous for preaching at airports until they were banned. Others, like the Church of God, tried to bait would-be disciples by having women flirt with or seduce males. Some just advertise on the internet or lure followers by offering IQ tests or personality assessments. Still, others gather new followers by promising more money or more power or a better job. The best way to see how these relationships evolve is through a series of hierarchies or concentric circles. Usually, those on the outer perimeters don't witness the humanness and manipulation that goes on behind the curtain. Thus, in their innocence, they tend to think everything is honest and upfront. However, the closer you get to the cult leader, the more dangerous it becomes. Now, this isn't true for all cults or religions, but it is true for many of them. The best example I know of is the late Guru Satya Sai Baba. If you stayed on the outer circle or the lower rung of the hierarchy, you wouldn't have known that he faked his magic tricks and that he was sexually manipulating a large number of schoolboys. The same holds true for those in MSIA. The closer you got to John Roger Hinkins, the founder, the more one witnessed his numerous unethical actions. Very few disciples of Gary Olson, founder of Masterpath, know that he plagiarized some of his books in order to make money and that he was for a long time a chain smoker of marijuana. This kind of stuff is not in their brochures, so only those on the inner circle get access to the very humanness of these various gurus. Additionally, there is no doubt that these multi-level marketing companies act very cultic in how they push their membership to secure more members and more money. We have seen this in the EST, later Landmark, Insight Transformational Seminars, and Arbonne, where the real motive is to enrich the founders. Prosperity consciousness is also rampant in many Christian groups in California and elsewhere, particularly when they try to get naive individuals to tithe and send prayer money seeds. Quite frankly, many religions and cults are really fronts for a sophisticated pyramid or Ponzi scheme. The deeper lesson about cults. I have noticed that by doing intensive research on a few cults, particularly Eckankar, it has provided me with a window to better understand other religious groups and the various dynamics that go on under the surface. One of the things I have better understood is the need for individuals to find meaning in their lives, regardless of whether or not their particular faith is factually honest or not. In 2014, I gave a presentation to the Dayal Educational Institute in Agra, India, focusing on the theory of meaning equivalence in religion. Here is a brief excerpt explaining it. I think the simplest reason that there are thousands of religions around the world is due to meaning equivalence, which is that any meaning is better than no meaning, provided such meaning makes one want to live an extra day. It is not really an issue of whether one religion is truer than another, or even that a particular religious system is simply made up, but rather that the believer finds something of value or solace in it. The fundamentalist Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Scientologist each have differing ideologies, but what they share in common is that they are each believers, and it is the act of believing and not necessarily what is believed, that is the motivating force. This is a very obvious but nevertheless telling point that is too often obscured by a relentless focus on doctrinal differences and not on what is the same with all devotees without exception, the brain. Also, one of the most peculiar traits I have noticed is that the sense of belonging to a tight religious community is very important and serves as an important bonding mechanism, keeping individuals within the fold, even if he or she knows that the cult or cult leader are corrupt. In MSIA, several of the most powerful people in the organization had no such status outside the group, and thus it was difficult for them to disassociate from the cult, since they would lose respect and status that they had within the group's hierarchy. Eckankar's founder, Paul Twitchell, was infamous for attempting to lie about his past and invent a new mythology about his life and work. We have all used the term genealogical disassociation to describe how some new religions become autonomous by denying or hiding their past associations, since they want to be seen as something distinct or new or innovative. This tendency for genealogical disassociation is much more common in religion than one might first suspect. John Roger Hankins, founder of MSIA, has tried to downplay his association with Eckankar and their theology, even though he was clearly connected to them for a spell and highly influenced by their teachings. Ching Hai, the well-known guru, tried to deny for many years her close association with the notorious Shabbat yoga guru, Thakur Singh, since she didn't want to be tainted by her former guru's sexual exploits. Adi Da, otherwise known as Franklin Jones, has tried to redact any and all references, even in his own autobiography, that clearly showed he was a member of Scientology for over a year. And the list goes on. Perhaps the most surprising thing I discovered was how charisma is more or less a social construction and has little to do, ironically, with the leader or guru in question, even if disciples tend to believe otherwise. Simply put, any person given the right social setting can be perceived as a charismatic leader, provided that the setting and staging is done in a certain context. This would explain why outsiders to cults tend not to see what the insiders perceive. Cults and their damaging impact. The damage can be extensive, ranging from mass suicides, as we saw with Jim Jones in Jonestown in the late 1970s, to murder, to death threats, to physical abuse, to deep psychological traumas. It all depends, of course, on the religious group in question. 3 years ago, the well-known spiritual teacher Andrew Cohen was forced to resign because his closest followers eventually revolted and pushed back against years of abuse and tyranny. Here is a short list of the abuses they suffered, excerpted from Hal Blacker's The A-List of Andrew Cohen. Hitting, slapping, punching of students by Andrew Cohen and other students at Cohen's command. At times, a group of men was ordered by Andrew Cohen to corner and attack fellow students, and at times, men were ordered to restrain a man while Cohen hit him. Having students pour buckets of paint over the head of a former student who was helping to work on the Fox Hollow and Lighton Next premises as a form of punishment and humiliation. Using repeated group and individual pressure tactics on a student who Andrew Cohen knew to be psychologically vulnerable in order to induce her to contribute approximately $2 million for the purchase of the Fox Hollow compound in Lenox, Massachusetts, the headquarters and residence of Cohen and the Enlightened Next community. Soon after meeting this student, Cohen had elicited from her that she had a trust fund and was in intensive psychotherapy 4 times a week, and persuaded her to cease her psychotherapeutic treatment. Requiring a student to visit prostitutes repeatedly over a several-week period and to provide detailed, faxed reports on these visits to Cohen, despite the student strongly expressing his disgust and emotional trauma over having to do this and daily begging Cohen to be allowed to stop. Witnesses saw Cohen reading and listening to the reports of the prostitute visits with great interest, enjoying and laughing at them. Blacker's list catalogs 30 more abuses, from financial to private. What is the most common damage, however, is that the student gives up his or her critical thinking faculties and succumbs to all sorts of mind-numbing and magical ways of justifying their respective cult leaders' actions, even when they go against his or her moral antenna. Now, to be fair, I have no doubt that some members have benefited from their association with certain cults. There can be many reasons for this, but I think the primary one is due to the individual's own sincerity for improvement. The catch, though, is that the would-be disciple tends to attribute whatever benefit they derive from the group or the leader, and not where it is really coming from, their own self. This reminds me of the late unknowing sage Baba Fakir Chand, who was very respected master of Shabad Yoga. Unlike other gurus, Fakir was disarmingly frank and forthcoming about his own limitations. Fakir personally gave me worldwide permission to publish his autobiography shortly before he died. Recently, a philosophy student of mine who went through the work we published provided a nice summary of what Fakir Chand had realized. I think it is highly instructive and worthy of a full citation. Chand revealed that all gurus are ignorant about the real cause of the visions and miracles attributed to them, and that because of this ignorance, the gurus gained power and devotion from followers that accredited omnipresence and omniscience to them, even though these gurus were neither. This realization came to Chand in 1919, when he was posted in Iraq with the military. After a fierce battle, the forces were low on ammunition and feared the end. Chand received a vision himself in which a sacred figure implored him not to fear, that the enemy had come not to attack but to collect their dead. He was told to allow the enemy to collect their dead and not waste ammunition on engaging them. He sent for the major, informed him of his vision and the directions he received in it. The major followed these directions, and the enemy did come. They collected their dead and did not attack like Chand's vision had said. After 3 months, the fighting subsided, and Chand returned to Baghdad. When he arrived, he was made to sit on a raised platform, offered flowers, and worshipped. Chand was surprised and inquired as to why he was being worshipped and that he was not their guru. He was informed that during the battles, these worshippers had visions of him, stating that he appeared to them during the battle and gave them direction for their safety. Chand was astonished, having given no thought to their plight because of the danger he faced himself. Questions arose within himself due to this incident, but he found his faith strengthened. He concluded, "Whosoever remembers God in whatever form, in that very form he helped his devotee." What Chand came to understand is that these manifestations were created by the mind. Is it possible that such manifestations are due to our subconscious minds, taking evidence collected by the conscious mind, analyzing the information, and deciding on the course of action that would best lead to self-preservation? That the transpersonal encounters are merely whatever sacred form we find most comforting, most guiding? Could we be attributing survival to deities when it is truly our own minds responding to danger and acting in the interest of self-preservation? The cultic influence. Cults are not behind us by any means, but they are changing forms and adapting to new needs and new desires. Cults have influences in some remarkable ways, including the very way we eat. I have noticed that many of these alternative religions, particularly those concerned with vegetarianism, have established some very successful food-related enterprises. Such companies include Nature's Path, founded by Aaron Stevens, who was a follower of the late Kirpal Singh, founder of Rouhani Satsang and a one-time guru to Paul Twitchell of Ekankar, among many others. Amy's Foods, founded by Andy and Rachel Berliner, who are both initiates of the late Charan Singh of Radhaswami Satsang Beas, has attracted millions worldwide, including the famous singer Shania Twain, and the list goes on. Paramahansa Yogananda's influence can be seen throughout Southern California, particularly in his beautiful landscaped centers ranging from the Lake Shrine in Santa Monica to the SRF Temple grounds overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Encinitas. Scientology, of course, has had a major impact with its glamorous Hollywood center, and there are alternative ashrams, centers, and meeting places dotted throughout California. If we include charismatic marketing gurus like Tony Robbins and others, then it is readily apparent that the cult leaders and their messages have had an impact on both television and movies. Yet there has been a shift from the archetypal authoritarian cult leader of the 1960s and 1970s to a more open and technically progressive teacher or guru, although there are indeed quite a few exceptions. This may be partly due to a series of cult exposes that transpired during the 1980s onwards, where guru figures such as Swami Muktananda, Adida, John Roger Hinkins, Paul Twitchell, L. Ron Hubbard, and a whole slew of Buddhist and Hindu gurus, particularly Satya Sai Baba, were shown to have clay feet or worse. Today, as far as I can ascertain, technology, from iPhones to iPads to Oculus Rift and so on, have become so popular and ubiquitous that it is not an exaggeration to say that the Internet has become the real guru of 2017, and this is where a vast majority of young people are turning. Whether it's to follow a particular gifted YouTuber or a new and upcoming visual artist, young people today have many more options available to them than before. Cults are not behind us by any means, but they are changing forms and adapting to new needs and new desires. The cult of technology may be the most powerful one yet, and it is for this very reason that Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and others are very fearful of where artificial intelligence may lead. The cult leader of the future may indeed be an AI animatronic. We are cult members of the future who are more addicted to our smartphones than anything else. One report says we look at our smartphones more than 150 times a day on average. So the deeper question is, why the human mind tends to be obsessed or wrapped up with a certain ideal or icon or path. Given our evolutionary history, cults just change form but do not disappear. In the 1960s, many sociologists felt like God was dead, and that secularization would eventually replace religion. That didn't happen. As Professor Andrea D.M. Lane wrote in her book, The Rise of New Religions, gods don't die, they just resurrect in new forms. The suicide cults and Heaven's Gate. I was living in Del Mar at the time, which wasn't very far from where the members committed suicide. I even knew about Marshall Applewhite's years prior due to another cult researcher who had done some pioneering work on his small but growing group. Prior to Heaven's Gate and Branch Davidians, the mass suicide in Jonestown was the ground zero for a more critical appraisement of new religions. Because of Heaven's Gate's involvement with the Internet and its unusual theology and the subsequent suicides, it attracted massive media attention. In the United States, these three tragic events, from Jonestown to Heaven's Gate, have clearly impacted how the general population sees minority religions with deep suspicion. Of course, the child pedophile scandal that rocked the Roman Catholic Church and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism has probably added to a growing suspicion of skepticism of religion in general. This may partially explain why agnosticism and atheism is much more acceptable to the younger generations than it was in decades past. If the distinguished historian of religion, the late Mercy Eliade, is correct that religion is an element of consciousness and not merely a stage within it that we grow out of, then we should expect cults to persist, even if the mass media presents them in the most negative light possible. With the rise of the World Wide Web, it has allowed almost anyone to start his or her own new religion. I know of a number of individuals who have started their own cults, although on average they have a minimal number of followers. Nevertheless, the dominant cults today in California are invariably Christian-related, with all sorts of denominational offshoots sprouting up in various counties, usually over leadership or doctrinal disputes. I would have put Scientology at the top of my list of cults that are dangerous, but there has been so much criticism of them now in books, film, and television that I think the public is dutifully aware of how bad an organization it can be. The most dangerous of cults are those with leaders who claim absolute authority, and there may well be small groups that have yet to come to our attention that will end up being similar to Heaven's Gate. Ironically, it seems that our more established religions are even more dangerous than cults, particularly in carrying out violence or sexual abuse. In this regard, Islamic fundamentalism stands out, as do some apocalyptic Christian groups. The future of cults. We may be witnessing the Uberization of cults, since it is now possible for anyone, anywhere, at any time to create their own mini-movement. I saw this first happen back in the early 1990s, where certain individuals, such as Michael Martin, now deceased, and Michael Turner, still living, started posting on various news groups that they were enlightened masters and had the ability to lead souls to higher regions of consciousness. Neither of these individuals had an organization to speak of, except that they were prolific posters on the web. I am not even sure if Michael Martin had any followers, except that he became well known for his megalomaniacal posts. Michael Turner, on the other hand, has only had a handful of students, even though he has tried to reach out for new recruits with new ebooks and newsletters. The most alarming, ongoing danger is for naive neophytes to falsely believe that another individual has supernatural power and knowledge, when, in point of fact, they have neither. The more we understand the modus operandi behind the Shandian effect, how we mistakenly project onto others what we ourselves are doing neurologically, the less likely we are to be hoodwinked by charlatans. The problem now is that we have a flood of fake news items circulating around the internet, and unless one is a seasoned skeptic, it is far too easy to be duped and manipulated by information that at first glance appears to be factual, but which isn't. We have seen a tremendous amount of lying in our political arenas, and the same holds true in the religious realm. Thus, the ongoing danger is in the virtual world, where it is far too easy to confuse the image with reality and derive a benefit from those who cannot distinguish the difference. I am convinced that technology and artificial intelligence will bring a whole new way to present religion. We can already see how much video gaming has changed the culture. The same will hold true with various religions, since they will try to provide a deeper and richer experience to its new recruits. I can foresee in the future we will have designer religions that will provide users with a remarkable and converting experience, convincing him or her of the supposed truth of that particular religion. This may seem far-fetched, but it isn't. To give one crude but telling example, think of the impact that Mel Gibson's The Passion had on audiences worldwide, and that was just a 2D film. Imagine what will happen when VR and religion intertwine. The cults of the future will be virtual, and therein lays the uncharted territory. Chapter 3: The Guru Who Wouldn't Quit. Andrew Cohen emerges from his downfall. I can't say I was surprised. I always had a suspicion that Andrew Cohen, given his some 30 years as a self-proclaimed enlightened master and his recalcitrant narcissism, wasn't quite ready to give up the guru gig. It didn't take very long either. It's only been 3 years since his dramatic downfall. Although Cohen is not explicitly clear on what exactly his reemergence will mean or what role he expects to take or how ex and future students should treat him, a close reading of his recent self-justifying statement on his newly resurrected website gives one deep pause, especially since his repeated mea culpas seem transparently contrived. The following is Andrew Cohen's latest attempt to get back in the guru game, even if he must do so with his long tail of disciple abuse between his legs. Writes Cohen, quote, "In the spring of 2013, my worst nightmare came true. Everything that I and my closest friends had spent the previous 3 decades building came crashing down around us. The entire international body of students and centers, 27 years of tireless work and commitment, disappeared almost overnight. It was something that I simply never contemplated happening, and it happened mainly because I was unwilling to face my pride. Something in my role as a spiritual teacher I had compelled countless others to do. The last 40 years is replete with stories of gurus and spiritual teachers falling from grace. As a younger teacher myself, I had boldly but naively declared how disillusioning it was when proclaimed spiritual masters had feet of clay, and most importantly, proved to have moral failings. To my shock, humiliation, and horror, I now found myself in the very same position. My life as a controversial teacher has been a story of unending paradoxes and contradictions. Over the last 30 years, I have been both revered and despised. hated, and adored. I have been respected for my contributions and condemned for my mistakes. For most of my adult life, I lived in a context which I had unchecked power and authority. As a result, it is undoubtedly true that too many suffered. It's also true that many experienced extraordinary breakthroughs and developed in the most beautiful and profound ways. The truth is, as crazy as it sounds, I believe I was infallible, and for a long time, the majority of students believed it too. In the end, I lost everything and caused untold suffering to many people only because of an irrational refusal to admit the simple truth. Like most human beings, I am deeply flawed. The gift of my own teacher's grace and the illumination he afforded me didn't change that. The truth is, it usually doesn't. As integral philosopher Ken Wilber has repeated so many times, enlightenment does not inherently remove shadow. Only truly wanting to face the truth about ourselves does. And that is very, very hard and usually an incredibly painful process to endure. My fall from grace has shaken me to the core. It has compelled me to wrestle with my demons in ways I never would otherwise have done. I have experienced depths of darkness in myself. I have wrestled with shame. I have doubted everything I have ever stood for. For a very long time, I didn't know how I would find the resources in myself to face the enormity of my hypocrisy and betrayal. It's taken me the better part of the last 3 years, and I have had a lot of help. Incredible love and support from dear friends, important guidance from therapists, and painful yet liberating insight gained from shamanic plant medicine. All this has over time gradually brought me back to my senses, myself, and most importantly, to God. In this return to myself, what has also resurfaced is that mystery to which I declared an unequivocal yes when I met my teacher 3 decades ago. It is the undeniable conviction. It's the undeniable conviction in the miraculous nature of our deepest selves, the immediacy of spiritual freedom, and the boundless inspiration to share that truth with others. I know for some this will seem like an unforgivable offense. How dare I contemplate such a thing after falling so far? And yet I feel I have no choice. The easiest thing for me to do would be to disappear, and to be honest, in my weakest moments, that's all I want to do. But the greatest challenge is to return to the work, not only in spite of my fallings, but because of them. I have learned the hard way what I did wrong. I have spent a lot of my time over the last years contemplating why so many inspired spiritual communities led by charismatic teachers, more often than not, have crashed and burned. Most of the time, it seems to be for the same reasons. The leader or teacher has unexamined shadow, and the ancient forms and power structures around which the communities are built are almost always outdated remnants from the distant past, shockingly unsuited for our time and this era. Because of this, those who have had the courage to put everything on the line for the promise of paradise too often get burned with disappointment and disillusionment. It is by now a painfully predictable story, but I never imagined that I would be telling that very same story about my own community, Enlighten Next. That being said, to characterize the 27 years of this radical experiment as unremittingly negative would be reductionist in the extreme. More importantly, it would also do a deep disservice to all who gave their hearts and souls to our sacred work. The intense commitment, seriousness, and intelligence of everyone involved gave rise to some of the most profound collective breakthroughs imaginable, the most exquisitely moving expressions of love and spiritual insight, and finally, to the teachings of evolutionary enlightenment that still burn brightly within me. Against all odds and undoubtedly to the consternation of many, I feel a renewed responsibility and obligation to uphold the beauty and the promise of those teachings. without in any way wishing to underestimate the mistakes I made as a consequence of my own unexamined shadow. I would be dishonoring the truth of my own experience if I were to walk a different path. This is simply who I am. What this means in detail at this point, I don't yet see clearly, but I feel a powerful and sacred obligation to honor and take forward that which I and my close friends and students had worked so hard to make manifest in the world. I also feel a great sense of obligation to journey into the heart of this profoundly complex subject and, with the help of others, to return with some answers. It is my fervent hope that in doing so, I can help illuminate the multifaceted and divisive issues that so often lead to such catastrophic failures. The most challenging thing is to be able to carry this forward in the context of what I have learned can go so badly wrong. Enlightened failed primarily because of my own issues, but I cannot simply put the past behind me and move on. Those issues are also what I am drawing on as a source of renewed wisdom and insight. I am holding them within me as some of the deepest lessons I have ever had to learn. Most importantly of all, the last 3 years have convinced me that it is possible to place these events in a much bigger context than my own story. This open-ended, future-oriented inquiry is what is calling the deepest part of me to move forward." End quote. From a skeptical perspective, and one that I am sure many will share, particularly those who were most burned by Andrew Cohen's unnecessarily authoritative and systematic abuse, this latest apologetic from Cohen is anything but. Rather, it is a strategic piece of justifying why he feels like he can still be a spiritual teacher and still redeem his evolutionary enlightenment movement. Quite simply, Andrew Cohen would have reduced his 1,000-plus words down to one sentence: "I'm back!" After watching how closely involved he was with the scathing documentary on his life and work by Conscious 2, it became exceedingly obvious to me and other observers that Andrew Cohen was orchestrating a not-so-subtle comeback to the position he missed most, being the center of attention. Andrew Cohen wants to be a guru, even if he was a lousy one for some 30 years. He feels entitled to the position, and willy-nilly he wants the spiritual enlightenment back, even if he has to grovel for it with repeated mantras of, "I am sorry," to appease those most hurt by his egregious and nefarious actions. Although Cohen speaks of now accepting his Jungian shadow, quoting Wilbur yet again with, "Enlightenment does not inherently remove shadow," he doesn't seem to realize how disingenuous he can be in wanting to move forward when he still hasn't come to grips with his real problem, egomania. It isn't about you and your problems, Andrew, or how to get back into the spiritual sport. It is rather about how you treated your students for nearly 3 decades. Instead of worrying about your status, it might be more enlightening if you thought about getting a real job and paying back your disciples' hard-earned money that they offered to you only to see it wasted by bad advice and bad investments. It might be singularly impressive to hear you say, "I am not getting back into the guru business, but instead I am going to live an exemplary life of giving and not taking. I want to live up to my apology by action, and thus I am going to stay away from the very movement that wreaked so much havoc on so many sincere seekers who wanted something better." I am not a betting man, but I would wager that Andrew is not going to listen to such advice. Why? As he himself admitted in his web statement, "Against all odds, and undoubtedly to the consternation of many, I feel a renewed responsibility and obligation to uphold the beauty and the promise of those teachings, without in any way wishing to underestimate the mistakes I made as a consequence of my own unexamined shadow. I would be dishonoring the truth of my own experience if I were to walk a different path. This is simply who I am." Notice how in several sweeping self-proclamations, Andrew Cohen once again bypasses his students' wishes only to uphold his own. Cohen is blind to his most obvious flaw. He shouldn't be a guru. He was shoddy at it, and in the end caused much more harm than good. Yet, Cohen's arrogance remains unchecked when he writes, "I would be dishonoring the truth of my own experience if I were to walk a different path. This is simply who I am." These last two lines should be heeded as a warning that nothing fundamental has changed in Andrew Cohen's modus operandi. It is always about him and his truth. So what is Andrew Cohen proposing to do? Well, for starters, he is back doing much of what he did before, even with a slight twist, what he calls the ongoing exploration of the role of both student and guru in a post-mythic context, which includes 1. A new video introduction to the evolutionary impulse, 2. A website journal about his latest interviews and activities, 3. A section for students to buy his old and new books, 4. An audio section to listen to his various dialogues and other engagements, and 5. Presenting new retreats for interested seekers to interact with Andrew Cohen in person. As the old saying goes, a leopard can't change its spots, or in this case, Andrew Cohen can't change being a narcissist. Sincere aspirants don't need more guru posers, and they especially don't need Andrew Cohen cluttering up the spiritual marketplace once again, hawking his wares. I once heard a very wise counsel during my many travels to India when an old sage told me at the tender age of 22, "Any guru who wants to be a guru isn't worthy of your attention." You were lucky, Andrew, that you got off so easily. Many of your disciples feel you should be in jail. If an elementary school teacher did just 1/10 of what you did, he or she would be forever banned from the classroom. Perhaps you should listen more carefully to your ex-students and stay retired. As Rumi insightfully taught, let silence take you to the core of life. Chapter 4. The Narcissist Rises from the Ashes. Andrew Cohen's latest newsletter, which arrived today on April 28, 2017, reconfirms what many critics and ex-students have long suspected would happen after his unceremonious fall from grace. The narcissistic guru has risen from the ashes and repackaged himself and his enlightenment for yet another chance in the spiritual marketplace of ideas. After a 4-year sabbatical from teaching, given how he bankrupted his organization and systematically abused many of his closest followers, Andrew Cohen is back with a newly honed message, as his newsletter intones. Quote, "In recent months, Andrew has begun to rediscover the gift of awakened consciousness that touched so many people during the first 27 years of his teaching career. Simultaneously, he has woken up to his own flawed humanity and the lens through which the teaching is expressed and been profoundly reshaped by his experiences and insights over the past 4 years." End quote. In the same missive, it even goes on to allege that one of the catalysts for why Andrew Cohen eventually apologized was due to experiences he had when partaking of ayahuasca, which gives one pause for why it would take a drug session for this so-called enlightened guru to wake up to how abusive he had been for decades. As the newspaper spins it, quote, "Andrew is painfully aware that the entire episode was badly handled and that many were left in limbo. There was very little clarity and virtually no sense of closure for anyone. For many students at the periphery of Enlighten Next, and for those who had deep or growing interest in the teachings but perhaps less formal involvement, it was completely unexpected and shocking." Andrew, too, was deep in shock. He took a long break from public life, during which he went through a challenging personal ordeal. He discovered that while his awakening had been profound and authentic, at the same time there were disowned and unexamined psychological issues that had remained in play. Thus began some deep emotional and psychological work and a series of revelations about his own condition and unconscious motives. To his horror, he realized that these issues had caused suffering to many of his students in ways that he did not understand at the time. In 2015, following further revelatory experiences with the Amazonian plant medicine ayahuasca, Andrew published an extensive apology in which he took full responsibility for the hurt and suffering he had caused as a consequence of these unexamined motives. End quote. If a first-grade instructor did just 1/10 of what Andrew Cohen did to his students, he or she would be forever banned from the profession. Sadly, Cohen is still under the delusion that he is enlightened and that his previous actions should not prevent him from teaching in the future, despite the overwhelming evidence that he caused much more harm than good. Ironically, we have much higher ethical standards for grammar school teachers than we do for gurus of Cohen's stripe. But instead of a deep and sincere mea culpa and recusing himself permanently from assuming such a position again, Andrew Cohen believes he still should be regarded as an enlightened master. Others who felt the full brunt of his misconduct argue that Cohen should be in jail and spend the rest of his life earning money to pay back his debt to those he emotionally and financially ripped off for years. But Andrew Cohen is not interested in a real apology and a real transformation where a fallen guru stays out of the limelight. He wants back in, even if he has to grovel a little here and there to do so. Yet his narcissism remains fully intact, so much so that he can, with a straight face, publish a newsletter which proclaims, quote, Andrew's gift remains undimmed, and we feel his recent discoveries are a badly needed salve. In the light of his own dramatic fall from grace, it is his aim to illuminate the reasons why such catastrophic failures occur in so many spiritual communities. Most importantly, he has been grappling with the question of how we can evolve the teacher-student model for the future. End quote. As one heated critic has recently opined, quote, Andrew, there is nothing to grapple with. You repeatedly harmed those in need, and you exploited them in the worst way possible by consistently acting as a dictatorial tyrant, more bent on satisfying your own egotistical desires than in truly understanding what pain you were inflicting on those who looked up to you for guidance. Let others with much higher ethical standards work out how the teacher model should evolve, just as we wouldn't want an abusive school instructor coming back into the classroom. We don't need Andrew Cohen coming back as some sort of newly packaged, illuminated guide. The world doesn't need more Andrew Cohens. Stay retired, get a real job, pay back all the money you took from us, and perhaps then your apology might be viewed as genuine. Oh, but I see that is not your modus operandi. End quote. One of the more revealing passages in the newsletter, and one which displays in a nutshell how Andrew Cohen still doesn't truly understand the depths of his transgressions, is when it claims that, quote, to date, the narrative has been shaped largely by critical voices, and our sense is that it has become increasingly distorted and one-sided as a result. End quote. Distorted? One-sided? No, Andrew Cohen all by himself generated that very narrative that was truly distorted and one-sided. His critics haven't shaped the proceedings. Andrew Cohen's nefarious behavior did that. The very fact that Andrew Cohen was in deep shock by the fallout he caused prima facie speaks volumes about his so-called enlightenment. Simply put, most normal and unenlightened people know when they emotionally injure another human being. That Cohen was so oblivious to how much hurt he inflicted on others clearly underlines why he should never have been a guru in the first place. Do we really need a second act from this egotistical poser? Now he wants students to come join him for yet another round of high-priced seminars on several stops in Europe, from Paris, France to Basel, Switzerland. Like an unrepentant snake oil salesman, Cohen is still selling his wares on his website, including 6 previously published books that contain no retractions or caveats or amendments whatsoever. The more obvious path that Andrew could choose, but which he seems reticent to take, is for him to forego the entitled teacher position and the money he will garner from it, and simply follow the path of silence. But apparently enlightenment is a bewitching mistress, and instead of opting for staying in a confessional mode and making reparations as a neophyte, Andrew Cohen wants his cake and to eat it too. His new incarnation should carry the apt book title, Narcissism 102. In trying to justify why Andrew Cohen has come out of hiding, his newspaper explains, quote, "For this reason, in the interests of embracing the complexity of the issues raised by the dramatic rise and fall of the community, we feel that a clearer and more nuanced perspective is needed. The lessons of failure are squandered if we become fixated and immobilized by the failure itself, and therefore our focus is to reach for a higher synthesis of understanding, in which we can clearly distinguish the baby from the bathwater. For many critics of Andrew, it seems it's all bathwater, and we feel the time is long overdue to move on from this polarized perspective." End quote. And once again, Andrew and his minions have made a fundamental mistake in blaming his critics for thinking it's all bathwater. No, many of Andrew Cohen's ex-students are perfectly fine with the bathwater. They just wanted to throw out the immature baby that spoiled it. That Cohen thinks otherwise is just another indication of how truly unenlightened he remains. But fear not, because like the famous Energizer bunny that percolated in our television advertisements in years past, Andrew Cohen will not be denied his due. He wants his guru status back, even if it means he has to eat a bit of crow to do so. Hell hath no fury like a guru scorned. Chapter 5. The Guru Transparency. I have great admiration for deep meditators, those who have, by dint of their tireless practice, penetrated into the hidden corridors of their own self-reflective awareness. The interior quest is a noble one and worthy of emulation. However, it is a fundamental mistake to believe that those who have enlightened states of consciousness are, by such awakenings, also able to explain the outer world of astronomy, physics, chemistry, and the cosmos at large. As the oft-repeated truism underlines, being an expert in one field doesn't automatically translate into being an expert in another one. I say this precisely because far too often we have conflated inner knowledge for outer and vice versa, neglecting the too obvious fact that experiencing exalted internal states is distinct from knowing their ultimate causality. I may know the taste of a sweet apple, but such an experience tells me little about how it was made. Far too often we have projected onto our teachers, gurus, and masters omniscience and omnipotence, falsely believing that because of their great spiritual achievement, they have also secured a supreme working knowledge of the physical universe. Spend any time with such sages, and you will immediately realize that this is not the case. But believers tend to persist in their idolatry, and when confronted with their teacher's mistakes, try to ideologically spin them away. This is tragic. Why? Because any guru worthy of his or her salt is only helpful to the degree that they serve as a transparency. Transparent guru is a window that allows the neophyte to see beyond the form that is instructing. In other words, the teacher is not so much a mirror that reflects back to the student, but rather a portal for showing her what is beyond. Yet it is too easy to get caught with our own distensions about spirituality and even worse when the teacher manipulates the same for his or her own aggrandizement. A meditating guru may be completely ignorant about molecular biology and yet still be a great guide for helping one to meditate, if he or she doesn't pretend otherwise. Yet, instead of realizing that we must ultimately travel alone on our contemplative sojourns, we too often opt for a Wilbur-like Atman project, where we attempt to find the underlying truth in ways that prevent it and force substitute gratifications instead. The guru far too often serves as our replacement for real work, since we project upon him or her chattels we are not. We defend the image in all sorts of immature ways, as to not come to grips with the reality that he or she is just as human as ourselves, even if a far superior specimen of it. Therefore, we opt for the master is perfect and knows all things, and is without blemish, as a way to inflate our own self-worth, even as it sabotages our own efforts to take responsibility for what we must do. In sum, it is easier to project that our guru is God than to take stock of our own limitations and then reflect upon how best to progress. I bring this up because recently I was rereading for the umpteenth time a book I loved in my youth, Daryai Lal Kapoor's Call of the Great Master, which is a personal memoir that describes the life and teachings of Sawan Singh. Baba Sawan Singh Gruwal. Sawan Singh is a highly esteemed master of Shabad Yoga and had a very large following throughout India and abroad. Having read everything that I could by Sawan Singh that is available in English, I became a deep admirer of him, and I turned to his advice on meditation almost daily. He has some remarkably good suggestions on how to meditate and what to expect. However, many followers of him, and those who follow his successors, have tended to believe that Sawan Singh was also godlike in his knowledge, and that it extended to science as well. This is not necessarily true, since though Sawan was educated as an engineer, his knowledge of other subjects, such as physics or biology, was limited. For instance, in attempting to explain his own version of intelligent design and the majestic order of the universe around us, Sawan Singh is quoted as saying the following, quote, "Look at the billions of stars and planets moving in their orbits, never staying an inch from their appointed tracks or colliding with each other. You often hear of railways and steamers so carefully and ably directed by your wise engineers coming into collisions, but did any star ever dash against another?" End quote. When I was younger, I probably skimmed over this passage and didn't give it a moment's attention, since I was more interested in the narrative flow than in any astronomical predictions. However, I was certainly aghast the other night when I read it again. My first reaction was, what? How could Sawan Singh be so wrong about something so elemental in astrophysics? But then I paused for a second and realized that Sawan said this at a time when knowledge of astronomy was still in its infancy and that he was not conversant with astrophysics and what it has uncovered. Sawan was mistaken, and that should not be surprising. I see no other way to spin this, and yet I know devotees will be tempted to do so, since the guru must, by his ultimate spiritual attainments, know the inside secrets that us mere mortals are not yet privy to access. This is, of course, silly and completely unnecessary. But does Sawan's limited knowledge of the cosmos at large and how it operates then disqualify him from providing wise counsel on how to meditate? I think not, since the two spheres of inquiry are quite distinct, if not wholly mutually exclusive. Thus, we do a disservice to both our chosen spiritual mentors and ourselves if we think they know more than they actually do. Better to focus on their area of expertise than to perforce expect that they are Einsteins without limit. Ken Wilber went right to the jugular on this issue when he insightfully pointed out that he had never seen a perfect guru run a sub-4-minute mile with his perfect body, or explain Einstein's theory of relativity with his perfect mind. Wilber argues that perfection is an essence, not existence. One could go even further and say that to expect perfection from anyone, regardless of his perceived status, is to be forever disappointed. Why intertwine our minds and hearts with such convoluted notions? Why not accept the humanness of our teachers and get on with the real task at hand, which in this specific context is meditation? Or if we choose to persist in our mythological beliefs, then we will have to bypass day to day, if not moment to moment, our intellectual integrity in the name of blind faith. It is here that I think Ken Wilber's hierarchical spectrum is not only illuminating, but also extremely practical in differentiating what we are trying to accomplish when meditating. In the magical phase of meditation, the guru is perceived as having miraculous powers, including the ability to transmit Shakti or awakening just by a single touch or glance. Even the mantra that the guru conveys is believed to have sacred numinous power. To the degree that a neophyte believes in this occultism, it acts as a very powerful aphrodisiac, regardless of its actual facticity or lack thereof. It isn't too hard to understand why. The placebo effect is a universal phenomenon, though poorly understood, and works when an advertised product is taken as efficacious. Humans have an inherent and structural capacity for a fantastic array of inner experiences. Couple this with our innate predisposition to project power onto others, particularly those we see in elevated positions of authority, and it is little wonder that gurus reap the psychic and monetary benefit of our Freudian-like transference. The meditator drinks up this magic potion where cause and effect gets confused and where image and reality become crisscrossed. The problem with the magical phase of meditation is that it takes a naive mind to sustain it, since any rational discernment will immediately upend its chicanery. As anyone conversant with sleight-of-hand tricks knows too well, the moment a magician explains how he or she does it, the mesmerizing spell vanishes, and we are left deflated by not seeing its obviousness sooner. The mythic stage in meditation is governed by a set of beliefs and an in-out group mentality. If I follow just the right rules and don't deviate from what is required, then I will invoke the grace necessary to achieve an enlightened state. Even if my mind rebels, I should have faith that the spiritual master and the teachings know best. Whatever doubts may arise, boomerang back to me, since I have obviously not conformed properly to what is required. The guru is not at fault, since he is perfect or flawless. It is my karma, my weakness, and my lack of understanding. The mythic meditator is the sinner par excellence, since he or she must be lacking, not the path or the teacher. The rules cannot be questioned, since they are inviolate or divinely revealed. Thus, the mind surrenders to the authority of tradition, or of the holy book, or to the will or the ordained leader. Now, the magical and mystical aspects of our mind can, in the right context, serve us quite well during meditation, but they invariably fall short, and we see through the weaknesses of these dogmatic pronouncements. Our rational mind breaks through and asks questions that magic and myth cannot answer, and we realize that doubt and skepticism are superior forces that should be unleashed and not held in check out of fear. In the paper and scissor game of the mind, Occam's razor cuts right through the thin topography of fanatical divination. The doubting meditator ignites a fire that burns through any and all isms, and through a painful, dark of the night soul, upturns the most cherished of ideals. In this existential impasse, God is dead, The guru is human, and the sacred books nothing more than letters on a page. The meditator confronts the abyss where magic and myth have no impact and where logic and reasoning seem to be the only guiding beacons. But this, too, is but a stage, and there comes a point where doubt itself leads beyond itself to direct experience, wherein the meditator, now free from the shackles of religious obligation, embarks on an adventurous quest to find the very source of one's own consciousness, ever realizing that whatever arises cannot be defaulted into a preset model or interpretation. Fakir Chand, the renowned Shabad yoga sage, explained this process well with his metaphor of hanging on the gallows, where one is without prior support, since what had come before were a hierarchy of bonded attachments. Letting go, the meditator sets sail for uncharted waters and by necessity must discard the maps that had hitherto given so much purported guidance and solace. The bubble, in order to understand its essential nature in the ocean, must at one point burst and merge back from where it came. Meditation then truly becomes dying while living, and the meditator, along with his or her meditation, dissolves into which is unknown, and ends up echoing Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous last line of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Notes: the Kirpal statistic explains how this works in meditation. It turns out that almost everybody has the inherent ability to see inner light and hear inner sound. Moreover, almost everybody has the capacity to have an out-of-body experience and behold wondrous inner visions. You don't need to go to an Indian guru to have such experiences. Indeed, you don't need to go anywhere at all. But that's not what Kirpal Singh and his successors told their vast following. Instead, unsuspecting seekers, who number in the thousands, were taught to believe that it was the guru himself, not the disciple, who was orchestrating the elevation of the soul into higher regions. But Kirpal and crew were not being completely forthcoming about the mechanism that governs access to such amazing sights and sounds. That mechanism is the brain, and that 3 pounds of glorious tissue is the lot of all humans. In the early 1980s, when I was teaching religious studies at a Catholic high school, I tried several meditation experiments with my students, which convinced me that Kirpal Singh and other gurus like him were taking undue credit for their disciples' inner experiences. In my trial meditation sessions, I informed my students beforehand about the possibility of seeing inner lights and hearing inner sounds. Naturally, given the boring routine of secondary education, my students were intrigued. I informed them that I knew of an ancient yoga technique that would facilitate their inner voyages. I turned the lights off, instructed them briefly about closing their eyes gently and looking for sparks of light at the proverbial third eye. I told them that I would touch some students on the forehead lightly with my fingers. They meditated for some 5 minutes. I then proceeded to ask them about their experiences. To my amazement, since I felt that Kirpal Singh and others were actually transmitting spiritual power, the majority of my students reported seeing light. A few students even claimed to have visions of personages in the middle of the light. Others reported hearing subtle sounds and the like. I repeated the experiment on 4 other classes that day. I have also in the past 10 years conducted the same experiment on my college students. The result, though differing in terms of absolute numbers, is remarkably the same. The majority sees and hears something. It doesn't take a neuropsychologist or sociologist trained in statistics to realize that Kirpal Singh and others were simply tapping into an already built reservoir of meditational possibilities. What was unique about Kirpal's approach, at least in comparison with other Radhaswami gurus, was that he claimed to be the responsible agent, the medium through which such inner experiences can be transmitted. Kirpal's disciples generally did not question his grandiose claims, since many of them did indeed see and hear something during their meditation. What they, of course, did not fully appreciate was that almost anybody could have induced them to have inner experiences. Religious devotees seem overly eager to give up responsibility for their own neurological happenings, believing instead that it takes a master to draw their attention within. This may or may not be the case, and I am not implying that gurus don't have anything good to offer, but one thing is certain: Kirpal's claims, and others like his, cannot be divorced from an initiate's own cultural and psychological field of interplay. It is that interplay, that acceptance as fact of a guru's method and the disciple's own inherent capacity neurological or mystical for inner experiences, which fuels the claims of would-be masters. It seems wise to me, in light of near-death experiences and the plethora of other meditation accounts, to inspect how we see and hear our inner voyages of light and sound. Then we may be able to understand why such experiences can occur to almost anyone, anywhere, anytime. It may also help us contextualize and appraise the claims of gurus like Kirpal Singh, who insist on taking credit for their disciples' wondrous visions. If, as I have suggested, that anyone can act as a conduit for such otherworldly experiences, then Kirpal and gurus like him should be judged on some other criteria, since their claims for uniqueness and exclusiveness are anything but unique and exclusive. The Kirpal statistic is exactly that: the probable outcome that the majority of meditators, provided the necessary instructions in Shabad or Nad yoga practice, will see and hear something. Chapter 6. Devotional Thickness. The Sacredness of Human Longing. I didn't expect to be overwhelmed with emotion, and I certainly didn't expect to be transformed by the experience. But there I was, witnessing something quite astonishing, and right in the midst of it, a long-forgotten book title by C.S. Lewis came to the forefront of my mind, Surprised by Joy. The atmosphere was electric, but what struck me most forcefully was the unconditional love that permeated the surroundings. It was on the night of March 21st, 2017, and I wanted to see the holiest of Sikh Gurdwaras, the Golden Temple. My family and I had just arrived in Amritsar in the Punjab just a few hours prior on Vistara Airlines from Delhi. I was in India conducting research for a new project for Oxford University Press, and only had 12 or so hours before having to travel to the Radhaswami Satsang Center at Beas. Although I had first visited the Golden Temple in the summer of 1978, I had never seen it at night. I knew that the surrounding area had been dramatically renovated and that the Golden Temple had become increasingly popular as a tourist destination. But what I hadn't realized was how crowded it had become at almost all hours of the day. There are several factors that make the Sri Harmandir Sahib unique. One immediately notices, for instance, that there are no security checkpoints for entering into the complex. No restrictions of any kind on who may or may not enter the sacred grounds. All that's required is to wear proper attire, going barefoot so as to cleanse one's feet before entering, and wearing a head covering. The Sikh religion was founded by Guru Nanak, who was born in the later part of the 15th century and established a lineage of 9 succeeding human gurus. It was the 10th guru in the 18th century who proclaimed that the holy writings of 6 of the Sikh gurus, along with selected writings from such sants as Kabir, Namdev, and the Sufi mystic Sheikh Farid, would serve as the final and eternal living guru for all followers of the Sikh religion. Written in Gurmukhi script, the Guru Granth Sahib is held in the highest respect by Sikhs worldwide, since it contains the essence of their spiritual philosophy. The book is housed in the innermost sanctum of the Golden Temple and is recited daily and is treated with the utmost care. Our driver, with the very apt and accurate name of Happy, wanted my family and I to have a glimpse of the inner sanctum of the Sri Harmandir Sahib, even though it was just after 10 p.m. at night when a palanquin carries the sacred holy book of the Sikhs, the Guru Granth Sahib, to the Akal Takht Sahib. At this time, visitors, especially foreigners, are discouraged from entering the temple since devotees cleaned the Sri Harmandir Sahib for an hour or so. Fortunately, however, due to Happy's persistence, we were allowed to witness the diligent work of these Sikh Savadars as they sang in the most intense and enchanting way the Gurbani Kirtan. I cannot even begin to describe how engaged and sincere the many Savadars were in doing the cleaning. It wasn't perfunctory in the least, but rather seen as a great honor to be able to do such work, and one could palpably feel the energy, the excitement, and the yearning underlying the devotional singing. It was a surreal scene, the likes of which I will never forget. Although I am not a Sikh, it was impossible not to be transfixed by the magnificence of the Golden Temple, but even more by the earnest love and devotion I personally saw among the vast throng who felt blessed by being able to glimpse their beloved Guru. Coming home late that night, I realized anew that what makes something sacred or numinous is the earnest desire of humans for that which transcends them. While I am sure there is a better description for what I witnessed, somehow the phrase devotional thickness rung true. It is a human product, and as such can illuminate and shine forth at any time, anywhere, at any pace. It is not restricted to any particular ism, and because of this, it can manifest unexpectedly. Of course, some places and some gatherings tend to bring out the very best in us, and because of such, they become sacred. The sanctity is not necessarily geographical, but rather part and parcel of our biological and biographical makeup. Bring the deepest yearning in a human being to the forefront, and you have the very best of spirituality, even if it is in a conference room filled with agnostics and atheists. What transforms is the human heart, and what I saw in the Golden Temple was both simple and profound, a wide diversity of people bringing their best selves and their deepest aspirations. It makes perfect sense, regardless of one's religious affiliation, to want to visit such communal centers of worship. As we all know, the world has far too many areas where humans bring their worst selves and act accordingly. Even though there is much to criticize about religion, it is vitally important to remember that at certain times and in certain places, unbounded human longing can be allowed to flourish, and it is then and there that we can get a glimpse of the transcendent. This unique human quality, which in German is called Sehnsucht, though usually expressed through religion, can manifest wherever and whenever we acknowledge the mystery that both precedes and transcends us. Whether it is a gathering of astronomers pondering the deepest reaches of the Milky Way, or devoted Sikhs honoring the wisdom of their gurus and their teachings. Chapter 7. White Cranes Against a Black Sky. I read about this incident many years ago in a biography of Indian saints that I happened upon in the graduate library at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and it has haunted me ever since. It describes a young Indian boy who falls into a state of ecstasy while walking in a village field in Bengal, India, during the mid-part of the 19th century, when all of a sudden he sees a black rain cloud, and then majestically a flock of white cranes flying in the sky. The juxtaposition of the two opposite colors was overwhelmingly beautiful. The very sight sent him into samadhi, and he fell unconscious. Later, this very boy would become world famous as Sri Ramakrishna. I have always wanted to tell this story in a short movie, and after I finished the little film, see the Neural Surfer Vision YouTube channel, I became even more keenly interested in other visions that Ramakrishna had through his relatively short lifetime. Having already read almost everything I could about Sri Ramakrishna, particularly the famous Gospel, as recorded by Mahendranath Gupta and later translated into English by Swami Nikhilananda, I realized that there was something unique and profound about his insights, more so because he was not formally educated. I have given lectures about Ramakrishna and his disciples, especially Swami Vivekananda, and many of my courses on religion at various universities and colleges, including the California School of Professional Psychology, California State University, Long Beach, and Mount San Antonio College. These presentations got a bit controversial after I included Jeffrey Kripal's contentious 1995 study, Kali's Child, which claimed, among other things, that Ramakrishna's spiritual experiences were in part caused by early childhood trauma, perhaps sexual in nature, which manifested later on with pedophilic and homoerotic overtones. I remember that one official at the Vedanta Society of Southern California took umbrage that as a professor I would have my undergraduate students read such a scandalous and inappropriate text. Indeed, he wrote me a very long and detailed rebuttal to Kripal's thesis, pointing out that Kali's Child contains several faulty transitions from the original Bengali, and because of this had arrived at a number of spurious conclusions. While I realized that Kripal's book was upsetting, I felt that it at least opened up a whole new line of discussion about religious visions, even if his own psychoanalytic analysis of such missed the mark. There is something more to Ramakrishna's mystical experiences than mere Freudian sexual repression, and I think it is important to provide a wider purview to what may have transpired in his life, even if we furnish a neurological and sociological framework to them. More importantly, though, the Bengali's religious visions dovetail with those of Baba Fakir Chand, the famous unknowing sage of Hoshiarpur, who coincidentally was born in the same year that Ramakrishna died. Fakir, like his Bengali predecessor, also experienced a wide variety of spiritual experiences, but gallantly tried to explain them as being mind-generated and not due to some exterior divinity, even as he championed the interior quest. Chapter 8. The Bihi Shuffle. Invoking religious authority to bypass scientific implications. A culture based on superstitions will do worse than one based on scientific knowledge and rational thoughts. Venkatraman Ramakrishnan. Although I was raised in a fairly strict Catholic family, attending Catholic schools for some 11 years, I had open-minded parents when it came to all things intellectual or scientific. Surprisingly, one of my first deep encounters with the theory of evolution came in my high school religious class, where our required text was an illustrated book about Teilhard de Chardin and implications of Darwinian natural selection. Our teacher, Brother Joseph Connell, part of the Brothers of Holy Cross at Notre Dame, explained that Roman Catholicism accepted the theory of evolution and posits a more metaphorical, yet still vitally elemental, view of Adam and Eve. Simply put, Catholicism welcomes the scientific view on the development of man, but believes that God's guiding hand was ultimately behind it all. This was all fine and good when I was young, but even then I suspected that what Catholicism wanted was to have its cake and eat it too, or more precisely, have the pretense of accepting science but without having to seriously stomach its much more radical implications. Don't get me wrong, I applaud Catholicism's openness to science, even if it did take centuries to formally apologize to Galileo's long-dead body and memory for his revolutionary breakthroughs. But I question its genuine sincerity when pressed on such metaphysical issues as the virgin birth, transubstantiation, and the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. It seems as if Catholicism's embrace of science only extends so far, And when a core doctrine is contradicted by the latest findings in physics, or chemistry, or psychology, the Catholic oligarchy retreats behind the all-purpose excuse of divine mystery. Well, if we look at the progressive history of science over the past few centuries, it seems awfully suspicious that long-standing divine mysteries have become less and less. When we didn't understand how the sun operated, we worshipped it. When we couldn't understand droughts, we prayed for rain. And when we didn't grasp how the brain worked, we spoke of demonic possession. It is a bit odd, if also a bit too telling, to ponder why there were so many miraculous events in centuries past when religions held political court. But today, such transmundane events are in abeyance. To put this more pointedly, even if more contentiously, why is it that when science is practiced, the gods tend to prematurely die off? One answer, of course, is that when reason is writ large, superstition disappears accordingly. Yet it is just a tad disingenuous when religions that on the surface applaud science's wonderful achievements are unwilling to engage with its more far-reaching implications. Is this because the core dogma of many religions has no real basis in fact, but survives primarily on the blind faith of its adherents? Or worse, by scaring their respective believers from truly thinking what they actually hold to be true? Sadly, I think the answer to both of those latter questions is yes. Religion dances with science so long as it substantiates its worldview and two steps off the floor when it is upended or fundamentally doubted. A quintessential example of this comes from Michael Behe in his 2004 essay, A Catholic Scientist Looks at Darwinism. Behe writes, quote, "Well, if the topic of evolution is fraught with pitfalls, then what is a Catholic layperson to do who simply cannot evaluate the scientific evidence himself? Although it can be difficult, I would simply urge people to reserve judgment, be patient, and look toward the Church for guidance in this philosophically charged area." As St. Augustine remarked, speaking of his embrace of the faith, "From this time on, I gave my preference to the Catholic faith. I thought it more modest and not in the least misleading to be told by the Church to believe what could not be demonstrated, whether that was because a demonstration existed but could not be understood by all, or whether the matter was not open to rational proof, rather than from the Manichees to have a rash promise of knowledge with mockery or mere belief, and then afterwards be ordered to believe many fabulous and obscured myths impossible to prove true." In Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II explains the Catholic faith allows a very wide latitude to reason in the area of the origin and unfolding of life, pointing out crucially that we need to realize in all things it is God of Israel who acts. I call this curious intellectual hustle the Behe Shuffle, where one invokes religious authority to bypass the purported ramifications of a scientific discovery. The operative fear here is that the Church will lose its power and sway over its members if they are allowed to follow science's pathway to its logical conclusion. Look very closely at Behe's wording and his citation of Roman Catholic sanctioned quotes. 1. Instead of simply allowing evolutionary biology to run its course and letting the empirical chips of data fall where they may, Behe suggests that the native layperson is better off looking toward the Church for guidance in this philosophically charged area. Huh? How is Catholicism a better guide here when in point of fact it is a scientific inquiry? Would Behe think the same about such advice if it came from a Scientologist who argued that it was better to listen to the counsel of L. Ron Hubbard when it came to controversial issues in astronomy? I think not. Replace Catholicism with any other religious ism, and you immediately see how myopic, or should I say cultic, Behe's advice really is, particularly coming from someone claiming to be well-versed in biochemistry. 2. Behe's extended citation of St. Augustine is curious indeed, since a careful analysis of it contradicts the essence of the scientific endeavor, particularly when the famed church father can write, apparently with a straight face, that it is not in the least misleading to be told by the church to believe what could not be demonstrated, whether that was because a demonstration existed but could not be understood by all, or whether the matter was not open to rational proof. But Michael Behe doesn't see it this way, just as most strident religionists of whatever persuasion don't see beyond their chosen belief systems. This may be understandable if Behe were preaching from a Catholic catechism to an already baptized congregation, but it is quite another if he wants to persuade agnostic intellectuals of his scientific argument. It is obvious that Behe shuffles between wanting to sound scientific and protecting his faith from the dangers of unabashed naturalistic thinking. In doing so, Michael Behe ends up tripping on his own misguided reasoning and leaves the reader wondering why Catholicism or any other religion should enter into a purely scientific debate. Why is the theory of evolution such a contentious topic? My own suspicion is that evolutionary theory explains too much, too well, and too simply, and because of this, religion is all too fearful of what such portends. Given science's recent track record, such a fear may indeed be well-founded, and all one can opt for is to do the Behe shuffle, invoking religious authority to sidestep the implications of a Darwinian worldview. There is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. Stephen Hawking. Chapter 9. Integral Apartheid. Ken Wilber's Cousins, Color Coding, and the Nazi Problem. While eating my typical breakfast of Nature's Path heritage flakes with Westbury soy milk, I was rereading Ken Wilber's 2006 book, Integral Spirituality, a startling new role for religion in the modern and postmodern world. And when I got to page 179, I had to put my spoon down because I was laughing so hard. In explaining how the majority of the Earth's population is caught in the ethocentric or lower levels of development, Wilber summarizes his questionable statistic with a line straight out of Donald Trump's lexicon. Quote, "To put it in the bluntest terms possible, this means around 70% of the world's population is Nazis." End quote. Now, this particular line wasn't what got me laughing out loud, but what Wilber said a few sentences later, where he cautioned, quote, "And please, no politically correct tisk-tisking here. I'm talking about some of my best friends and most of my family, certainly all of the cousins." End quote. I have to admit, even though I have been a harsh critic of some of Wilber's ideas, particularly his misrepresentation of evolution and his fawning praise of vainglorious gurus such as Adida and Andrew Cohen, I do commend him for his willingness to go out on a limb to crib the title of Shirley MacLaine's 1983 paranormal-filled autobiography. By doing such, it makes it easier to pinpoint once again some of Ken Wilber's major intellectual weaknesses, including his persistent tendency for hyperbole, misuse of statistics, and color-coded stereotyping. Now, to be fair, I don't know Wilber's cousins. Are we talking first and second only? So maybe he is privy to their reading material and other habits. Mein Kampf prominently displayed on the fire mantelpiece along with photographs of Eva Braun? While I can readily appreciate that there are different levels of moral and cognitive growth in the human population, and that our religions reflect varying stages of consciousness, is Wilber's pernicious habit of number grouping, name-calling, and color labeling really a progressive and informative way to genuinely understand the cosmos and our place within it? Does Wilber want all his quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types reduced to a catchy meme such as integral apartheid? I think not. Wilber rails against scientific materialism and myopic reductionism. but in the process naively indulges in his own New Age form of it by repeatedly reducing a set of people and a set of ideas to a hierarchical potpourri of color coding. Thus, in Wilber's schema, instead of patiently and exhaustively engaging in argument at each turn, he resorts to chroma casting in such generalist and dismissive terms that essential nuances get lost in his premature labeling. Reducing complex human intention and behavior to amber, red, or orange, etc., may be a fun and easy way to catalog variations along a spectrum, but it is dangerously lazy. It is also a form of reductionism par excellence, despite its protestations to the contrary. Wilber alleges that in doing research for The Many Faces of Terrorism, he noticed that terrorist acts around the globe, quote, had the same basic psychograph, amber beliefs with a red self, end quote. Such color coding may on the surface appear instructive, but this very lumping fails to provide the necessary contextual and individual information necessary to properly understand the variances amongst those committing such acts. Alleging someone is talking amber and acting red is classic stereotyping, and in doing such actually cuts off a deeper investigation, since it gives one the illusory sense of knowing what is happening. Wilber's chroma casting is a shorthand way of moving on and not looking at the odd sequence that doesn't fit into the preset model. We have already seen him do this repeatedly with his misrepresentations of evolutionary biology and his over-the-top appraisements of such nefarious teachers as Mark Gaffney, where he looks askance at those actions that don't dovetail with his earlier panegyric. Just take Andrew Cohen as one very telling instance. Wilber puts his credentials on the line, indulging and praising this self-styled guru to the hilt. But when Andrew Cohen was shown to be much less than advertised, we hear basically nothing but silence from Wilber on it. Richard Feynman captures well the naming mistake when he writes, quote, "You can know the name of a bird in all the languages in the world, but when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing whatever about the bird. So let's look at the bird and see what it's doing. That's what counts. I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something." End quote. Wilber is caught by this Mandalic temptation, where in a rush to fit everything in his integral map, he skips over the very information that doesn't fit neat and tight in his preset understanding. Life is messier than his integral theory lets on, particularly when certain facts upturn his cherished ideals. The real danger underlying all this is reification, where we make our abstractions into concretized things, so that we end up discussing generalizations and not the particulars that are invariably the exception. For example, Wilber conjoins Sikh terrorists of the Punjab and Muslim terrorists, wrongly claiming that both view suicide, quote, as a career promotion, end quote. As the BBC website on Sikhism explains, quote, Sikh gurus rejected suicide, and by extension euthanasia, as an interference in God's plan. Suffering, they said, was part of the operation of karma, and human beings should not only accept it without complaint, but act so as to make the best of the situation that karma has given them. End quote. Because he neglects to cite specifics, the reader is left with the wrong impression about what may or may not have motivated such actions in the first place. Details, and more details are elemental here, and while Wilber castigates scientific materialism for eating brain studies alive, he does something quite similar when he reduces human motivation and action in his own ad hoc, idiosyncratic color schema. Yes, these scaffolding projects can be helpful at times, but only if they serve for deeper and rich investigations that have the potential for upturning the very models they are predicated upon. Calling 70% of the world's population Nazis doesn't progress the integral conversation so much as unnecessarily sink it to sloganeering. Color-coding groups of people has a long history dating back to the Varnas in India, where classes of people were socially stratified into 4 major divisions. The Brahmins, priests, scholars, and teachers. The Kshatriyas, rulers, warriors, and administrators. The Vaishyas, cattle herders, agriculturists, artisans, and merchants. And the Shudras, laborers and service providers. Interestingly, the word Varna in the Vedas and in the Mahabharata refers also to color. We have already seen how insidious color coding has been when referring to race. Is it really that enlightening when employed in today's postmodern context relating to levels of consciousness, particularly when it is used as a form of intellectual leveling? I remember in my undergraduate days when friends of mine would take an introductory course in psychology and learn the rudiments of Freud's theory of psychosocial development, and with their newfound vocabulary proceed to pigeonhole all sorts of varied characteristics with Freudian terminology, diminishing us as merely repressed sexual beings regardless of context. I have noticed something similar happening when my college students in my critical thinking classes learn about logical fallacies, which they tend to overuse and often mistakenly believe they are refuting an argument when, on a closer inspection, they have succumbed to what is sometimes known as the labeling fallacy, or more simply understood as putting the cart before the horse. I enjoy Ken Wilber's evolving efforts to map the cosmos with his ever-encompassing holonic repertoire, but perhaps the oft-used idiom, God is in the details, should be placed front and center in integral thinking. Otherwise, if we follow Wilber's lead, we succumb to Trump-like sound bites where orange is the new black, where Republicans are frozen amber, where Andrew Cohen is a rude boy, or where one's cousins are Nazis. This isn't integral thinking. It's a cheap form of cerebral stamping. Or perhaps Wilber wants to develop his own new line of Hallmark greeting cards for parents celebrating the birth of their son or daughter with a direct quote from his book on integral spirituality. Quote, "Every time somebody somewhere has sex, they are producing a fresh supply of Nazis." End quote. Chapter 10. Donald Trump and Skepticism. There is much to commend in Ken Wilber's latest ebook, Trump and a Post-Trump World, since it attempts to incorporate a much wider perspective on how and why Donald Trump has been so successful in securing the presidency of the United States. Wilber clearly has thought deeply about this subject and offers a tantalizing array of observations, historical and otherwise, to enlighten his readers about how integral thinking can better appraise our current political climate. However, as much as I appreciate Wilber's efforts here, I find that his argument devolves too often into undocumented generalities and cheap color-coded reductionisms that, because they lack the necessary nuance, weaken the overall thrust of his presentation. In the following essay, I will underline where I think Wilber's framework needs shoring up. I thought it might be wise to quote Wilber directly, then explain what I find questionable. Quote, "Every now and then, evolution itself has to adjust course, in light of new information on how its path is unfolding, and it starts apparently spontaneously, but with this deeper morphic field actually operating, by making various moves that are, in effect, self-correcting evolutionary realignments." End quote. And a few pages later he adds, quote, "Evolutionary biologists in general tend to deny any sort of directedness or telic drives to evolution, seeing all of it as a random series of events selected by a blind natural selection." But this is just a holdover from the reductionistic scientific materialism of the 19th century. It overlooks more current scientific concepts that, starting with Ilya Prigoghine's Nobel Prize-winning discoveries, even insistent material seems to have an inherent drive to self-organization. When physical systems get pushed far from equilibrium, they escape this chaos by leaping into a higher-level state of organized order, as when water that is chaotically rushing down the drain suddenly leaps into a perfect downward swirling whirlpool, referred to simply as order out of chaos. If non-living matter inherently possesses this drive to self-organization and order out of chaos, living systems certainly do, and that definitely includes evolution, a drive that philosophers often call eros, an inherent dynamic toward greater and greater wholeness, unity, complexity, and consciousness." End quote. Early in his ebook, Wilber reveals what Professor Bennett Berger would call his metaphysical pathos, which is that evolution has a purpose and a direction. Wilber also indulges in a very questionable reification when he suggests that evolution itself has to adjust course, as if evolution was conscious of its long-term goals. Yet, as Douglas Futuyama clearly points out in his textbook Evolution, quote, "Darwin's alternative to intelligent design was designed by the completely mindless process of natural selection, according to which organisms possessing variations that enhance survival or reproduction replace those less suitably endowed, which therefore survive or reproduce in lesser degree. This process cannot have a goal any more than erosion has the goal of forming canyons, for the future cannot cause material events in the present. Thus the concept of goals or purpose have no place in biology, or any of the natural sciences, except in studies of human behavior." End quote. Wilber, in contrast to most working biologists in the field, wants evolution to be conscious and clear-eyed with an end goal in mind. I realize he may want to believe this, but if so, he is indulging in theology, not biology. Even Ilya Prigogine wouldn't agree with Wilber's assessment that evolution, Teilhard de Chardin, like directional aim, since the decreased physical chemist argues Chardin described the world as if he were outside of it. He was sure that every change, every new bifurcation, was going in the right direction, in the direction of increased spirituality. On the contrary, I am more impressed by the existence of multiple time horizons. A bifurcation can lead us to the best or the worst. We are participating in an evolution whose outcome isn't clear to us. So I leave open the question of the meaning of being. I'm not even certain whether, put in these terms, a scientific answer is possible. Probably it has more to do with feelings or emotions." End quote. Eros isn't a scientific concept as much as it is a God-laden one in order to provide evolution with an overarching drive. Yes, one can believe it, just as one can believe that Atlas is holding up the Earth on his back, but that doesn't make it testable or even reasonable, especially given the almost absolute indifference the known universe has to sustaining life. And even here we are talking about life forms that live for very short intervals in utterly brutal conditions and survive only by munching on their edible neighbors. If anything, the planet Earth looks like a prolonged horror movie where everyone ends up being tortured to some extent before succumbing inevitably to death. As such, therefore, Wilber is providing us with his own religious views dressed up in scientific garb, but without providing us all the requisite information. Alleges Wilber, quote, "The leading edge of cultural evolution is today, and has been for 4 or 5 decades, the green wave, green meaning the basic stage of human development, known to various developmental models as pluralistic, postmodern, relativistic, individualistic, beginning self-actualization, human bond, multicultural, etc., and generically referred to as postmodern. The primary purpose of the leading edge of evolution is to be just that, a leading edge of evolution unfolding, what Maslow called a growing tip. It seeks out, that is, part of its selection context rewards the discovery of, areas that are the most appropriate, most complex, most inclusive, and most conscious forms that are possible at that particular time and point of evolution. Here, Wilbur even gives evolution a prime directive, what he calls the primary purpose, which is always to push the envelope for the next stage in the great chain of being to unfold. If, however, we don't accept Wilbur's creation myth, then his entire integral edifice comes crashing down, since his political argument is built piece by piece upon this rather tenuous foundation. And upon this scaffolding model, Wilbur then tries to build his argument about our current political situation by using, as his habit, voodoo statistics and reductive color coding in order to make sweeping generalizations so as to drive home his thesis. Yet in doing such, he neglects, as usual, the very facts and numbers that would give one pause. Watch carefully how Wilbur invokes statistics without providing us the necessary references or context to properly appreciate whether they really substantiate his purview. Quote, beginning in the 1960s, green began to emerge as a major cultural force and soon bypassed orange as the dominant leading edge. It started with a series of, by and large, healthy and very appropriate forms: the massive civil rights movement, the worldwide environmental movement, the rise of personal and professional feminism, anti-hate crime, a heightened sensitivity to any and all forms of social oppression of virtually any minority, and, centrally, the understanding of the crucial role of context in any knowledge claims and the desire to be as inclusive as possible. The entire revolution of the 60s was driven primarily by this stage of development, and these events truly changed the world irrevocably. Ken Wilber and the Misuse of Statistics. In Ken Wilber's recent ebook, Trump and a Post-Truth World, which is filled with a rich array of pregnant opinions, he tends to overgeneralize using very questionable statistics to support his claims. In this regard, he is all over the map when he employs numbers that appear impossible to justify, much less verify as being based on sound scientific surveying methods. Why Wilbur is so sloppy in this regard, he makes one wonder if he is only interested in propping up his integral map to those who are already converted. Otherwise, suggesting that green is today's major leading edge stage with around 20 to 25% of the population, without providing where such a percentage comes from, is to invoke a not-so-subtle form of sociological abracadabra. In going over Wilbur's various stats, over 30 different citations in the course of his book, one is reminded anew of Mark Twain's popular and wrongly attributed witticism. Quote, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. End quote. Instead of providing us with parenthetical nuances, a necessary caveat for anyone truly interested in engaging in intellectual, honest inquiry, Wilbur, as is his pernicious habit, provides us instead with universal caricatures, such as, quote, meanwhile the leading-edge green cultural elites, upper-level liberal government, virtually all university teachers, technology innovators, human services professionals, most media, entertainment, and most highly liberal thought leaders had continued to push into green pluralism/relativism. What's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. End quote. Couldn't Wilbur make this same point without making things up that he cannot possibly know to be true? For example, having been a university professor and college teacher myself at various institutions of higher learning for the past 30-plus years, From the University of California, San Diego, to California State University, Long Beach, to Mount San Antonio College, do I find it at all plausible that virtually all university teachers in the humanities believe that what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me? Nope. In fact, I personally don't know of one professor in my some 3 decades of teaching who holds such a solipsistic belief. Where does Wilbur come up with such a percentage? Well, the answer is obvious. He makes it up, since in order to derive such a statistic, it would necessitate polling all university teachers in the United States and elsewhere and posing the question in the very format he frames it. Wilbur does his overall argument about our current political turmoil a great disservice by bastardizing it with phantom numbers. Wilbur laments that our culture is saturated with aperspectival madness, and because of this, evolution finds it's necessary to take certain self-correcting moves. These moves will not obviously appear as necessary correctives. They might indeed appear alarming, but the only thing more alarming would be for evolution to try and move forward on the basis of an already badly broken leading edge. The disasters would simply increase. Green, as a leading edge, had collapsed, and evolution itself had no choice but to take up a broadly anti-green atmosphere as it tried to self-correct the damage. And the one thing that was true of Donald Trump, more than any other single characteristic that defined him, more than his sexism, more than his racism, more than his xenophobia, is that every word out of his mouth was anti-green. Here again, Wilbur inappropriately reifies evolution and anthropomorphizes it as possessing conscious intention, akin to a captain of a ship who, checking his navigation maps, realizes he is about to hit a coral reef. But evolution isn't a thing or a person or a self-aware entity. It is rather a human concept to describe how nature changes over time due to varying environmental conditions. And even here, our use of the word nature is fraught with difficulties, since that, too, is an overly broad term to describe a vast array of physical subsystems. What is more disturbing, however, is that Ken Wilber implies that evolution has more or less created Donald Trump in its attempt to readdress Green's collapse, and which has led to extreme political correctness, all due to aperspectival madness, rampant amongst the cultural elite. This is not only a silly answer to why Donald Trump got elected, keeping in brackets for the moment that evolution is void of intention, but one which overlooks the very obvious fact that Hillary Clinton won the general election by nearly 3 million votes. Put aside sophomoric color coding and focus on the specifics of what actually transpired, because that tells us more than integral systems sloganeering. A more accurate political assessment must first focus on the Electoral College and how Donald Trump won 3 states that pollsters felt were safely in Clinton's corner. For example, if Hillary Clinton could have persuaded 30,000 voters in Wisconsin, 45,000 voters in Pennsylvania, and 12,000 voters in Michigan to vote for her instead of her rival, she would have won the Electoral College and the presidency of the United States. Therefore, the real question that should be asked with laser beam focus is why she lost those 3 states. And the answers there are not merely because voters hate Green, but because of a variety of factors, not the least of which is how Trump campaigned in each state and how voters felt about the economy. As Julie Mack explains, quote, "A close look at the number reveals that Trump won Michigan the same way he won Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, by way of overperforming in working-class communities, which was enough to offset Clinton votes in the urban and suburban corridors. As expected in Michigan, Hillary Clinton won the vote in Metro Detroit as well as a handful of other urban counties. But compared to Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, Clinton underperformed in counties such as Wayne and Genesee. which have Michigan's largest African American communities. Those two counties alone gave Obama a net gain of 439,202 votes, compared to 308,270 for Clinton in 2016. Clinton also underperformed in counties with large numbers of millennials. In 5 counties with a large college-age population, Washtenaw, Ingram, Kalamazoo, Isabella, and Marquette, Obama racked up a net gain of 173,362 in 2012, compared to 123,155 for Clinton on Tuesday. Meanwhile, there was a tidal wave of Trump votes in rural and small-town Michigan. In 48 of Michigan's 83 counties, Trump got at least 60% of the vote. And in 6 counties, Hillsdale, Kalkaska, Missaukee, Montmorency, Oscoda, and Sanilac, he got more than 70% of the vote. By comparison, Mitt Romney exceeded 60% of the vote in only 9 counties in 2012, and there were no counties where he got at least 70%. Trump also flipped some working-class counties that Obama won in 2012. That includes Macomb, Saginaw, Bay, Monroe, and Shiawassee counties. In all, there were 11 counties that voted for Obama in 2012 and went for Trump this week." End quote. Let's imagine that Hillary Clinton did turn those states to her side. Does that then mean, quote, evolution found it necessary for green to win as corrective to the red and amber assault, end quote? Of course not, because evolution has absolutely nothing to do with why Donald Trump won. Political strategies and a series of unexpected contingencies played their part, and most of it has to do with enthusiasm, or the lack thereof, for the two candidates involved. While I can appreciate that we would like to make philosophy out of the election of Donald Trump, it is a mistake after the fact and ad hoc quarterbacking that we are indulging in, since it reveals more about our own hopes and or disappointments than some real, genuine insight into the psychological development of human voters. Keep in mind that a 90,000 vote switchover to Hillary Clinton changes the whole game. If that happened, Wilbur's theoretic insight about what green lacks would be upended, and he would be spinning quite a different colored yarn. I quite understand that we want to look for deeper reasons for why Donald Trump was elected, but in doing so, we should concentrate on those states that turn the tide red instead of blue for him. The pun is intended for color-coded Wilbur aficionados. Because by focusing on those local conditions instead of sweeping meta-psychological portraits, we get a clearer understanding of how and why Donald Trump persuaded that small minority to turn towards him. Those factors, I suggest, have less to do with what Wilbur suggests and more to do with nuts and bolts of politicking and an array of specific contingencies. United States presidential election, 1960. The 1960 presidential election between Nixon and Kennedy is helpful here because the outcome could have been different if just 9,000 votes in Illinois and 46,000 votes in Texas swung to Nixon instead of Kennedy. This, of course, didn't happen, but it shows how small numbers, when switched, can alter how we view history and how we would have philosophically massaged what it all meant. Perhaps we would be more accurate in our political procrastinations if, instead of looking for the grand overview, we opted to look very closely at how small regional areas with greater than imagined influences can elementally alter elections, both locally and nationally. Because regardless of how we wax on about integral templates, it is the specific numbers added up that count and which determine the outcome of elections. Donald Trump won because of those numbers, and not because of some conscious plan on the part of evolution to dilute over-amped greenness on terra firma. Ken Wilber, Chroma Casting, and Google Searches. I have criticized Ken Wilber's color coding before in an article entitled Integral Apartheid, because such monochromatic labeling is what Daniel Dennett rightly refers to as cheap reductionism, since it oversimplifies human behavior and attitudes. Besides being intellectually lazy as a shorthand form of psychological stereotyping, Wilber's overuse of it, as we will see in his ebook on Trump, lulls the reader into inappropriately reifying colors as objective features. This has the unwanted effect of creating the illusion that such chroma casting is how different perspectives operate in a real world. Ken Wilber's color coding is reductionism at its most absurd. For instance, why use such a lettered schema when numbers would do as well? It would be just as easy to say the following: green is 6, red is 3, amber is 4, turquoise is 8, orange is 5, and then instead of wasting time and space, we can simply have a number discussion and/or debate. To illustrate how truly ridiculous and misleading Wilber's chroma casting can be, read the following excerpt from his recent ebook and then read it with just numbers. Quote, Trump's anti-green impulse runs serious, far, and vast, though he consciously is aware of none of this. Whether his proposals are red or amber or orange, they are always also anti-green. And that is the one thing they all have in common. Whether they are red, amber, or orange, they are all energized in part by this anti-green, self-correcting drive of evolution in search of a functional and self-organizing way forward. Or alternatively, Trump's anti-6 impulse runs serious, far, and vast. Whether his proposals are 3 or 4 or 5, they are always anti-6. And that is the one thing they all have in common. Whether they are 3, 4, or 5, they are all energized, in part by this anti-6, self-correcting drive of evolution, in search of a functional and self-organizing way forward. End quote. Reducing human intentions, ideas, and behaviors to colors is no different than reducing them to numbers, since both are merely indolent truncations that avoid a deeper qualifying analysis. There is no need to rush our intellectual appraisements. Given Wilber's modus operandi, we might as well use emojis when discoursing on politics. Instead of green, we could use a happy face. And instead of red being a 3, it could be a frowny face. Wilber's color coding is ripe for parody, and so it should be, since Wilber's consistent lack of nuance, misuse and statistics, and indulgent hyperboles detract from some of the larger points he is attempting to make. It also tends to get lost in a sea of generalizations, where specificity is warranted. In going over his ebook, I thought it might be amusing to see how many times he uses the word green, keeping in mind that its repeated usage is his way to short-circuit a deeper and more nuanced argument. After counting more than 100 times that he used the word green, I gave up even though I knew there were more to be had. It's actually 254. I found his discussion on aperspectivalism intriguing, even if, again, too exaggerated and simplistic to be compelling. For instance, Wilber seems surprised to note that Google's search engine isn't designed to discover truth when, as he argues, quote, there is nothing that checks whether any of the recommendations are actually true or good or beautiful or unifying or integrating or any other value, and express only the aperspectival madness of no truth to be favored, end quote. Well, this should come as no surprise to anyone conversant to how Google emerged as the most successful search engine in Internet history. In the early days of the web, as developed by Tim Berners-Lee, finding good websites was usually done almost randomly until Yahoo's Jerry Yang and David Filo at Stanford University in early 1994 created a hierarchical arranged subject database but even then there were humans searching out sites worthy of a second look. Google was founded in the late 1990s by Sergey Brin and Larry Page, both from Stanford University as well. They developed an algorithm where link popularity could be a suggestive and useful indicator of a particular web page's worthiness. This almost immediately garnered better results in terms of relevance for the user than other search engines at the time, including AltaVista, which was, for many academicians, the most inclusive and powerful tool for finding information on the web. What made Google so effective was precisely because it focused on popularity and not on assessing the intrinsic value of the site in question. That was left up to human beings in their quest for knowledge to determine. While I can readily understand that we have a growing apprehension of how powerful and influential certain computational and internet companies have become, Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, to name the leading five, we must ground our future fears in the history of what came before. Google has liberated knowledge and our access to it in ways unimaginable just 30 years ago, even if we should be cautious about how we employ it. But Wilbur will have us believe that Google is imprisoning us with its a-perspectival madness, since he argues, quote, Google is most definitely not organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. It is disorganizing the world's information in an atmosphere of a-perspectival madness, taking diversity to such an extreme that all views have an egalitarian and perfectly equal claim to validity. It is a leading edge that is deeply discombobulated. End quote. Here, as is typical of Wilbur, he grossly exaggerates to underline his criticism of a-perspectivism, neglecting to remember that it is up to human beings to make the final judgments and appraisements on what they find on the internet, not Google, not Bing, not Firefox, not Safari, or any other search engine. Yes, it can indeed be dangerous to over-rely on Google, just as it is dangerous to over-rely on the Encyclopedia Britannica or be caught in the delusion that the great books of the Western world are rightful and true repositories of all that should be known, lest we forget most editions of that widely owned but seldom read collection didn't have one female author or one of color. It is not so much that Google is entrapped in some evil a-perspectival lunacy, as Wilbur wrong infers, but that its powerful utility is precisely because it is inclusive and looks for the most popular returns from those who use its search engine. Anyone who is somewhat conversant with the internet and its long history should be aware that it is a tool and as such should be used with caution and care, including whatever new apps pop up from time to mine its riches. But instead of a judicious and more accurate historical lesson about how the internet and its most significant application, the World Wide Web, blossomed, Wilbur goes on to a rant where he blames academia for almost everything that has gone bad in the world and how universal liberalism has spoiled all that it touches. As Wilbur harangues, quote, and it's going terribly wrong because today's leading edge has virtually no idea of what genuinely right could possibly mean. The Guardian highlights the overall piece by pointing out that it doesn't just demonstrate this with Google, but also Facebook and indeed the general internet culture itself, the internet echo chamber. How could an item become the defining issue of our century without virtually every university in the world spewing out postmodern, post-constructionalist nostrums centering on the idea that truth itself is the single greatest oppressive force in the history of humankind? Originated by the green leading edge in academia, this a-perspectival madness is of no truth, leapt out of the universities and morphed into an enormous variety of different forms, from direct no-truth claims to rabid egalitarianism to excessive censoring of free speech and unhampered knowledge acquisition, to extreme political correctness that forced the best comedians to refuse to perform at colleges anymore, since the audiences lacked all sense of humor. You're allowed to laugh at nothing in a no value is better world, even though that value itself is held to be better. To far-left political agendas that in effect equalized poverty, to egalitarian no-judgment attitudes that refused to see any higher or better views at all, even though its own view was judged higher and better than any other, eulogized egalitarian flatland to a denial of all growth hierarchies, by confusing them with dominator hierarchies, which effectively crushed all routes to actual growth in any systems anywhere, to the media's sense of egalitarian fairness that ended up trying to give equal time to every possible, no matter how factually idiotic, alternative viewpoint, such as Holocaust deniers, to echo chamber social media where pleasant lies and reassuring falsehoods were the standard currency. It saturated the leading edge of evolution itself, throwing it into a performative contradiction and a widespread, explicit or implicit, aperspectival madness, which was soon driven by nihilism and narcissism, and a whole post-truth culture, which even invaded the internet and bent it profoundly. And that brokenness perfused the entire information grid of the overall culture itself, exactly the type of profound and extensive impact you expect a leading edge to have. It has indeed become the defining issue of our century, because not a single other issue can be directly and effectively addressed if there is no compass point of accessible truth to guide action in the first place." End quote. There is much to unpack here, but let's get right to the jugular and point out where Wilber grossly overstates his case and who and what is at fault. Wilber believes that universities worldwide are to blame for, quote, spewing out postmodern, post-constructionalist nostrums, centering on the idea that truth itself is the single greatest oppressive force in the history of humankind, end quote. First, no one university is exactly the same as another, and each of them have a large number of divisions, ranging from the sciences to the humanities, with their own departments. So to be clear, do the engineering departments claim truth itself is the single greatest oppressive force in the history of humankind? Do business departments? Do physics or chemistry departments? Do agricultural departments? Do biology departments? Do mathematics departments? Of course not. So who really is the boogeyman in the university that is wreaking such havoc on the world? Philosophy departments? English departments? Sociology departments? Well, even here, as any student or professor knows, there are wide variances of ideas and opinions. There is nothing uniform in any of these departments, much less some universal acclamation that proclaims to all and sundry, "No truth exists." Why does Wilber sink to such categorical nonsense? From 1984 to 1990, I taught in the Warren College Writing Program at the University of California, San Diego, and was once a mentor on how to engage students to the chairperson of the English department at UCSD. This was when Derrida, Foucault, and other deconstructionalist thinkers were something of a rage among a few professors in the humanities. But even when this postmodern movement was peaking, there were vigorous debates within and outside the academy about how to interpret key texts and what they ultimately pretended. But at no time, and this is the point I wish to emphasize, was there a widespread consensus about what Wilber alleges is rampant. That is, quote, "Your truth is yours and mine is mine, and the twain shall never meet," end quote. The one consistent theme in every academic department I have had the privilege to serve in is that objective standards matter and should be taught to each and every student, freshman or graduate. The notion that no truth exists is a fiction that Wilber is perpetuating in order to flog an academic straw man of his own making. No, academia is not the Frankenstein-like parent of all the green madness we see in the world and the internet. What happened is a bit simpler and more complex than what Wilbur proclaims. First, the internet was the brainchild not of your truth, my truth acolytes, but of those in the military and at universities wanting to open up a computational pipeline of communication. Furthermore, Tim Berners-Lee, operating out of CERN, working on his Steve Jobs-inspired Next computer, didn't develop HTML because he was inspired by a Derrida-influenced epiphany that all is relative. No, the Internet and the World Wide Web were created to solve communicative impasse and develop new tools for transmitting both trivial and important messages. What this did is democratize, not demonize, information, allowing the masses hitherto access to data and the ability to farm such for their own purposes, sometimes positively and sometimes nefariously. Ironically, the real culprit for what many find disturbing about the Internet isn't due to universities or its post-structuralist professors, but to businesses and entrepreneurs, again some progressive and some shady, wanting to piggyback on the ever-widening information highway and make money. I am quite aware of this because I have been on the Internet since 1984 and distinctly remember when the World Wide Web first went public. In those days, there were essentially no advertising and very little spam. That all changed, of course, when AOL and other service providers came online and businesses started to realize that fortunes could be made and lost by going online. In the 1980s, the Internet was more or less commercial-free. After 1994, however, it was flooded with all sorts of items for sale and exchange. Because the communicative platform of the net is flat, it allowed almost anyone to have a voice, and this opened up a floodgate of possibilities. Digital capital bloomed, and with it millions of voices that have never been heard of before. What this unleashed was the ability of erstwhile unknown individuals who couldn't afford to share their ideas, their pictures, movies, their opinions, their items, their whatevers, to express themselves in multiple ways. These were not people inspired by radical university professors baptized in all things deconstructive, but rather inspired by new possibilities and new openings for asseverations. Thus, the real reason why there is such a wide variance of facts and information on the net isn't because of some sinister leftist ideology, but rather because for the first time in human history, we are hearing voices from almost all quarters, which include those who would lie and deceive to make a fast buck. And contrary to a solipsistic free-for-all, a large number of Internet participants want elevated standards and have implemented procedures to distinguish fake news from real news. This includes websites such as Snopes.com, factcheck.org, and even Google Scholar that provides access to refereed journal articles. Therefore, it is wholly misleading for Wilbur to put such blame on green-eyed humanities professors peddling their no objective truth mantras to the unsuspecting public at large. Even the mostly democratic Wikipedia has established guidelines to avoid spurious entries, so much so, in fact, that the prestigious scientific journal Nature published a remarkable study in 2005 showing the then up-and-coming web-based encyclopedia to be favorably compared with Encyclopedia Britannica when it came to certain entries. In the past 12 years, Wikipedia has become even more reliable with stricter guidelines and has become widely used, particularly amongst scientists. But even here, the smart researcher knows that Wikipedia is a great place to start, but a bad place to end. So it is the same with any knowledge base, and this has been the case since time immemorial. Wilbur seems shocked that a Google search can't elicit responses that are not wholly truthful, as if the search engine should have nobler intentions in its page rank than merely what is most linked or popular. While this is understandable, it is extraordinarily naive to be unaware of the present-day limits of search. The same holds true for any book that we read or any newspaper article we digest. The reader must be a critical thinker/reader, and this applies to every aspect of life, not just the internet. Wilbur quotes Carol Cadwalader, writing for The Guardian, quote, as being particularly alarmed when she typed in "are Jews," and before she could finish, Google's search engines had provided the most likely responses, one of which was, "Are Jews evil?" Curious, she hit that entry and was taken to the authoritative Google page of the 10 most common and most popular answers. 9 of 10 said, in effect, yes, definitely, Jews are evil. Genuinely surprised and alarmed, she states, Google is knowledge. It's where you go to find things out, and evil Jews are just the start of it. There are also evil women. This is what I type, AREWOME, and Google offers me just 2 choices, the first of which is, are women evil? I press return. Yes, they are. Every one of the 10 results confirms that they are, including the top one, from a site which is boxed out and highlighted. Every woman has some degree of prostitute in her. Every woman has a little evil in her. Women don't love men. They love what they can do for them. With her disbelief and alarm growing, she continues. Next I type RMUSLIMS, and Google suggests I should ask, are Muslims bad? Here's what I find out. Yes, they are. That's what the top result says, and 6 of the others. Google offers me 2 new searches, and I go for the first. Islam is bad for society. In the next list of suggestions, I'm offered, Islam must be destroyed. Yet here, Wilbur is also being disingenuous and betraying the very integral approach he so stridently argues for. Because 24 hours after Cadwalader's article appeared in The Guardian, Google took action and actually remedied part of the problem and even came out with a detailed public statement explaining why such distasteful results can occur. Quote, our search results are a reflection of the content across the web. This means that sometimes unpleasant portrayals of sensitive subject matter online can affect what search results appear for a given query. These results don't reflect Google's own opinions or beliefs. As a company, we strongly value a diversity of perspectives, ideas, and cultures. Autocomplete predictions are algorithmically generated based on users' search activity and interests. Users search for such a wide range of material on the web, 15% of searches we see every day are new. Because of this, terms that appear in autocomplete may be unexpected or unpleasant. We do our best to prevent offensive terms like porn and hate speech from appearing, but we acknowledge that autocomplete isn't an exact science, and we're always working to improve our algorithms. But does Wilbur quote Google's explanation even though it, too, appeared in The Guardian the next day? No. Why not? Is it because it demonstrates prima facie the vacuity of Wilbur's entire thesis? Is it duplicitous of Wilbur not to cite the Guardian article explaining how quickly Google addressed the issue and how keenly aware they are about the limits of search? More precisely, how trustworthy is Wilbur if he only provides us with one side of an issue? I find it truly ironic that in his ebook, Wilbur doesn't include detailed notes, claiming somewhat lamely that, quote, I have intentionally not included scholarly bibliographic references. If interested, they can always be Googled, and if you do so, keep in mind what is actually involved with that search process, which is something that will become clear as you read this, end quote. If Google can mess up so badly, why not go the extra yard and supply references so that the no-truth-infected search engine won't lead us into more digital madness? I jest, of course, since it is obvious that Wilbur is writing with a forked tongue. Yes, we are awash with an ocean of information, and yes, we should be doubly cautious about what we find when surfing the net. However, it doesn't then follow that the mean green meme, preached by unnamed humanities professors, are wreaking havoc throughout cyberland. I would suggest, rather, that the real culprit on the internet is that too many individuals are allowed to post anonymously without facing consequences for their words or actions, and this has allowed far too much acrimony and incivility. It is not that vast swaths of humanoids don't believe in objective or higher truths, but that when given an opportunity to say whatever to whomever, whenever, some choose to act out on their baser emotions. Some just want to vent anonymously without having to take personal responsibility for the blowback. Green extreme has little to do with it. The Integral Myth. Ken Wilber as religious preacher. Although Ken Wilber has been described variously as a pandit, a scholar, a New Age philosopher, and a synthesizer, I find that he is mostly a preacher for his own self-styled religion, integralism. Now, to be sure, Wilber doesn't view his vast theorizing as advertising a new cult. Rather, he sees himself advocating an all-inclusive, all quadrants, all levels meta-view of human development. Yet, percolating underneath his entire superstructure is a deeply held theological doctrine that evolution is driven by a divine purpose, what he has variously called eros. Even though he has been severely criticized on several fronts over his misunderstanding of biological evolution, Wilber persists in pushing his own version of intelligent design dressed up in quasi-scientific garb. It is, in sum, Ken Wilber's creation story, and it is essentially a religious myth he is peddling, even if he continually preaches otherwise. A good illustration of Wilber's underlying apologue can be found in his numerous references to evolution and its purported foresight that are sprinkled through his new ebook on Trump. Must it be stated so simply? Evolution is not a force like gravity, but rather an after-the-fact description of how and why certain organisms survive and others do not. Make no mistake, Darwin's natural selection isn't akin to electromagnetism or strong or weak nuclear force. Natural selection is merely a descriptive term and not an altogether accurate one in which to explain how differential reproductive success over time can help shape and contour organisms to a variety of environmental niches. But there isn't a conscious entity choosing and eliminating a light of some overall master plan. No, evolution, natural selection, genetic drift, genetic flow, etc. are humanly manufactured words to describe a blind and impersonal process that occurs without any end goal in mind. Ken Wilber writes repeatedly as if evolution is a power in itself, continually conflating a descriptive marker with a prescriptive one. Wilber might as well say that gravity, with a capital G, is consciously intending to create black holes, supernovas, and expanding galaxies. Wilber's constant references to evolution, planning to do something or acting as some self-reflective correcting mechanism, is a not-so-sophisticated form of animism, where one imputes souls and personalities to trees, to rocks, to mountains, or, in this case, eros-driven evolution. Yes, Wilber may wish to believe such, but this is to completely misunderstand evolutionary biology and to replace it with his peculiar vision of intelligent design. In other words, Wilber is providing us with his own integral creation myth and preaching as if it is somehow a progressive scientific view when, in fact, it is nothing more than New Age theology. Wilber is an AQAL preacher par excellence, despite his protestations that he is a leading-edge theoretician on the very frontiers of science. What he does instead is cut off real science and replace it with his own ism, so as to convince us that evolution has a goal. Yet, just as gravity doesn't have a goal or a clear mind about what should happen, so it is the same with the development of life on this planet. Wilbur's animism is misplaced when it comes to natural selection, and because he has built his entire integral edifice upon such a mistaken understanding, his meta-theory has one very large, gaping hole in it. Wilbur repeatedly invokes evolution in a purely teleological sense, and lambastes current evolutionary theory for, quote, denying any sort of directedness or telic drives to evolution, seeing all of it as a random series of events selected by a blind natural selection, end quote, which he claims without evidence is a 19th century materialistic holdover. Not surprisingly, Wilbur neglects to explain why the vast majority of working biologists don't subscribe to his theonistic version of creationism, since that would necessitate actually engaging in a real scientific debate about neo-Darwinism. It is interesting to see how many times Wilbur uses the word evolution in his e-book, over 80 distinct mentions, and how almost invariably it implies a divine intelligence. Perhaps Wilbur would be better off if he stopped using the word evolution when he really means to suggest divine impulse. In any case, almost every time Wilbur invokes the word evolution, it is distinctly different than what biologists working in the field mean by it. Keep in mind that Wilbur's dogmatic assertions concerning evolution's direct aim is quite at odds with how most scientists view it. I have listed 25 major examples in chronological order from Wilbur's e-book to illustrate how he uses the term and what he is really implying by such. 1. Every now and then, evolution itself has to adjust course in light of new information on how its path is unfolding, and it starts by making various moves that are, in effect, self-correcting evolutionary realignments. 2. The primary purpose of the leading edge of evolution is to be just that, a leading edge of evolutionary unfolding, what Maslow called a growing tip. It seeks out areas that are the most appropriate, most complex, most inclusive, and most conscious forms that are possible at that particular time and point of evolution. 3. And when a perspectival madness infects the leading edge of evolution, evolution's capacity for self-direction and self-organization collapses. 4. Nihilism and narcissism bring evolution to a traffic jam halt. This is a self-regulating and necessary move as the evolutionary current itself steps back, reassesses, and reconfigures, a move that often includes various degrees of temporary regression, or retracing its footsteps to find the point of beginning collapse and then reconfigure from there. 5. If non-living matter inherently possesses this drive to self-organization and order out of chaos, living systems certainly do, and that definitely includes evolution, a drive that philosophers often call eros, an inherent dynamic toward greater and greater wholeness, unity, complexity, and consciousness. 6. And under such circumstances, evolution finds it's necessary to take certain self-correcting moves. These moves will not obviously appear as necessary correctives. They might indeed appear alarming. But the only thing more alarming would be for evolution to try and move forward on the basis of an already badly broken leading edge. 7. The disasters would simply increase. Green as a leading edge had collapsed, and evolution itself had no choice but to take up a broadly anti-green atmosphere as it tried to self-correct the damage. 8. And that is the one thing they all have in common. Whether they are red, amber, or orange, they are all energized in part by this anti-green, self-correcting drive of evolution, in search of a functional and self-organizing way forward. 9. Any specifically amber moves themselves are not directly part of the overall self-correcting drive of evolution, but the activation of amber itself most definitely is, and its voice desperately needs to be heard. 10. It needs to be transcended, most certainly, but it also, the lesson here, needs to be included if evolution is to return to its general, functional, and self-organizing drive of transcend and include. That is the secret, hidden but very real drive that Trump unconsciously rode to a victory that, because its primary driver was completely unseen, was a total shock to both camps and to every major pollster anywhere. 11. If it takes the latter route, it will be aligning itself with the self-corrective drive of evolution itself as it looks for a more inclusive and comprehensive base platform from which to again take up its leading-edge role of self-organization through self-transcendence or transcending and truly including. 12. So the crucial issue at this time is, what do we do next? How can evolution, which has taken a deliberate pause in its ongoing dynamics in order to refurbish its foundations much more adequately and accurately, move forward from what appears on the surface to be such a complete meltdown? 13. Each of these stages transcends and includes its predecessor, which is the generic drive or eros of evolution itself, the drive to self-organize through self-transcendence. 14. The ever-increasing inclusiveness, genuine inclusiveness, of holons and holarchies demonstrates a direction that is grounded in nature and that has been operative from the first moment of the Big Bang forward, a direction of self-organization through self-transcendence that is the primary drive of evolution itself. 15. And this indeed is exactly the type of genuine healing that embraces the self-correction that evolution is looking for. 16. Here's just one example of the slowly but widely growing realization of Green's complicity in the election of an amber ethocentric Trump, and an indication that the self-correcting drive of evolution is indeed kicking in. 17. The other possibility that would work to help the present self-correcting dynamic of evolution actually get some traction would be to introduce not a healthy green, but to directly introduce a turquoise integral stage leading edge. 18. This, after all, is exactly what the self-correcting move of evolution itself is attempting to introduce, and anybody adopting an integral stance would be riding the very leading edge of evolution itself with all of its goodness, truth, and beauty. 19. The leading edge has collapsed. It is now a few billion persons massive car crash, a huge traffic jam at the very edge of evolution itself, sabotaging virtually every move that evolution seeks to take. Evolution itself finds its own headlights shining beams of nihilism, which can actually see nothing, or narcissism, which can see only itself. 20. Evolution, in a decided move of self-correction, has paused and is in the process of backing up a few paces, regrouping, and reconstructing itself for a healthier, more unified, more functional continuation. 21. And although Trump himself will do little to actually address the details of this, as each of these stages works to redress the imbalances inflicted on it by an extreme green and its aperspectival madness, the overall effects of these recent events can indeed turn out to be quite healthy, allowing evolution to generally self-correct, adopting a leading edge that can actually lead, and thus allow evolution itself to continue its ongoing march of transcend and include, a self-organization through self-transcendence. 22. In order for that to happen, not only do the various earlier stages need to throw off the deconstructed shambles inflicted on each by an unhealthy green, but green itself has to heal, has to become truly functional again, has to reject its nihilism and narcissism, has to let go of its aperspectival madness, has to learn the difference between dominator hierarchies and growth holarchies, and introduce a developmental-based discriminating wisdom in order for evolution again to start moving forward in a truly self-organizing and self-transcending way. 23. And conversely, to the extent that at least this first step is not taken, then the self-corrective drive of evolution will continue to push and push and push into existing affairs, driving more Trump-like disasters as evolution redoubles its efforts to force its way through these recalcitrant obstructions. 24. Little by little, in other words, an integral awareness is helping to embody an evolutionary self-correction in its very actions. And 25. Understanding this election, as well as similar events now occurring all over the world, as a manifestation of a self-correcting drive of evolution itself, as it routes around a broken leading-edge green and attempts to restore the capacity of its leading edge to actually lead. This gives us a glimmer of real hope in an otherwise desperately gloomy situation. As is readily apparent from the previous list, Wilber not only believes that evolution is a real force, but that it has a unique desideratum. Given that Wilber hasn't budged from his Eros-driven agenda as the engine behind change in the universe, it is therefore not surprising that his integral logic can with a straight face imply that Donald Trump is somehow divinely ordained, since he was needed to counterbalance the mean green meme which has wrought such havoc on the world. Wilber is preaching a creationalist gospel here, even if it is dolled up in pseudoscientific garb, and like the good preacher he is, Wilber ends his ebook with his own God-inspired sermon when he writes, again without blanching. Chapter 11. Ken Wilber and Moronic Evolution. The Religion of Tomorrow and the Misunderstanding of Emergence. It's been 20 years since I first wrote about Ken Wilber's misunderstanding and misrepresentation of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. One would hope that in those intervening 2 decades, Wilber would have at least learned not to keep peddling his mistaken caricature of biological evolution and how it actually works. But that hasn't happened since Wilber, in his most recent book, The Religion of Tomorrow, still persists in presenting a false picture of the current theory, and in doing so propping up a straw man of his imagining so as to champion his own not-so-subtle version of intelligent design. One can only wonder why he is so reluctant to admitting his errors, yet after reading his newest, a weighty tome of over 800 pages, it became exceedingly obvious to me that Ken Wilber basically cannot accept how complexity can emerge from simpler processes without invoking a teleological drive behind its unfolding. Simply put, Wilber thinks it is moronic that blind processes could have led from bacteria to Bach, to cite Daniel Dennett's latest offering, which serves as a nice rejoinder to all things Wilberish. Watch carefully how Wilber presents the neo-Darwinian argument, keeping a close eye on how he skips over the most elemental of details in the process. Quote, "Rational reasons to believe in this miraculous spiritual dimension to reality include the following. A. The creative advance into novelty that is demonstrated by evolution itself and is inexplicable by mere chance mutation. Evolution from strings to quarks to subatomic particles to atoms to small molecules to massively interconnected molecules to asexual cells and early organisms, just for starters, is an awful lot of evolution in a universe that is supposed to be running down but can easily be seen as yet more evidence of creative eros or spirit in action, a self-organizing, self-transcendent drive, as Eric Jantz put it." End quote. Wilber cannot imagine how novelty can be introduced by natural selection unless there is a creative and intelligent force that foreshadows it. In an extended section where he quotes Alfred North Whitehead, Wilber concludes that, quote, "Without this novel or creative addition, nothing new would emerge anywhere in the universe, since the present would be totally determined and caused by the past." End quote. Yet, nowhere does Wilber provide his readers with a systematic and detailed explanation from physicists that completely contradicts his eros-saturated worldview, pretending that his on-top-of-it summations are sufficient refutations when in point of details they are nothing of the sort. As Olivia P. Judson explains in The Energy Expansions of Evolution, published in the prestigious journal Nature on April 28, 2017, quote, "Free energy is a universal requirement for life. It drives mechanical motion and chemical reactions, which in biology can change a cell or an organism. Over the course of Earth history, the harnessing of free energy by organisms has had a dramatic impact on the planetary environment. Yet, the variety of free energy sources available to living organisms has expanded over time. These expansions are consequences of events in the evolution of life, and they have mediated the transformation of the planet from an anoxic world that could support only microbial life to one that boasts the rich geology and diversity of life present today." End quote. In a more technical passage, Judson explains how chemistry and the utilization of free energy allows for the emergence of differences in eukaryotes and how such would have emerged from simpler processes. Quote, "In extant eukaryotes, organelles of mitochondrial origin take several different but related forms. Notably, only one, the standard mitochondrion found, for example, in humans, requires oxygen. 3 others are involved in forms of anaerobic metabolism. Of these, 2 produce hydrogen." These observations fit with the hypothesis, advanced by Martin and colleagues, that the ancestral eukaryote resulted from a prior symbiotic association between a hydrogen-dependent archaeon and a metabolically flexible alpha-proteic bacterium that, in the absence of oxygen, lived anaerobically producing hydrogen, and in the presence of oxygen, lived aerobically. If this hypothesis is correct, the ancestral eukaryote could have been a facultative anaerobe, able to live in both oxic and anoxic environments. Such a scenario not only accounts for the different types of mitochondria seen tant eukaryote, but also for the fact that today species with mitochondria that produce ATP through anaerobic pathways are sprinkled across the eukaryotic tree while exhibiting a similar underlying biochemistry." End quote. The emergence of novelty doesn't necessitate an overreaching guide hand where eros in action is necessary for atoms to combine into molecules and they in turn into living cells. No, complexity can arise from very simple conditions given the right geometric environments, as has been pointed out throughout the various sciences, from quantum theory to molecular biology to neuroscience to computer informational systems. Undoubtedly, the doctrine of emergence is one of the great unifying concepts of science, since, as Peter Watson points out in his illuminating text, Convergence, the idea at the heart of science. Quote, "That there are higher levels of organization in nature that are not predictable from properties found at lower levels, and that the future will continue to bring forth unpredictable novelties." End quote. But emergence and novelty don't necessitate a supernatural force to explain them. Combine 2 parts of hydrogen with 1 part oxygen, and you get water. Add a bit of wind upon a large surface of liquid and you get waves. One doesn't have to invoke Neptune to explain oceanography. Likewise, one need not invoke Eros to explain how the nuclei of deuterium and helium formed just minutes after the Big Bang occurred 13.8 billion years ago. Wilber's invocation of Eros is merely a placeholder for a God of the Gaps explanation and doesn't in any way help us better understand the cosmos at large. This is why he can, with a straight face, quote Hugh Ross as an astronomer and leave out that Ross is also a biblical literist and a strong advocate of creationism. Hugh Ross, for instance, claims, less than 1 chance in 10 to the 144th power exists that even one such planet, a planet that supports life, would occur anywhere in the universe. This, of course, is a statistical canard, no different in import than Fred Hoyle's famous junkyard tornado quip, wherein he exclaimed, quote, "The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable to the chance that a tornado sweeping across a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein." End quote. Not surprisingly, molecular biologists have turned Hoyle's analogy upside down and turned his fallacious reasoning into an object lesson about how evolution actually works, since, as John Maynard Smith rightly pointed out, no biologist imagines that complex structures arise in a single step. The real problem with invoking probability theory when discussing the rarity of life on planet Earth is that the statistics we employ are bounded by the limitations of our present-day knowledge. What may seem implausible in the past becomes evidential with great understanding in the future. This is particularly true the more we begin to see how vast our cosmos is, and whether or not we live in a multiverse with an almost infinite number of mathematical and physical parameters. More importantly, Charles Darwin was well aware of how improbable evolution by natural selection may appear at first, but given enough time and given a sieving medium, such as natural selection coupled with variation and inheritance, it algorithmically leads to design. In other words, design is a byproduct within nature and not a conscious intention. Stephen Wolfram captured this understanding in his book, A New Kind of Science, where he had a eureka moment when studying cellular automata. He realized that from very simple computational rules, a vast array of unimaginable and unpredictable complexity could arise with any conscious designer or intention whatsoever. He analogized that the universe we presently live in is the result of some very simple rudimentary computations, played out over time, and that none of it necessarily has anything to do with metaphysics or God. But none of this apparently is convincing to Wilber, who, in his rush to dismiss natural selection, consistently misrepresents it instead of actually dealing with how it actually works and what it ultimately implies. Instead of dealing with the nuts and bolts of molecular mechanics, he indulges in philosophical sophistry and reifications by repeating his mantra of transcend but include. It may work as a New Age feel-good slogan, but it has precious little to do with developing new breakthroughs in science. Even then, some organisms can develop complex structures simply by genetic drift, or what is occasionally referred to as neutral evolution. As Carl Zimmer elaborates in Scientific American, The Surprising Origins of Evolutionary Complexity, quote, "The scenario that Gray proposes for the evolution of RNA editing goes like this. An enzyme mutates so that it can latch on to RNA and change certain nucleotides. This enzyme does not harm the cell, nor does it help it, at least not at first. Doing no harm, it persists. Later, a harmful mutation occurs in a gene. Fortunately, the cell already has the RNA-binding enzyme, which can compensate for this mutation by editing the RNA. It shields the cell from the harm of the mutation, allowing the mutation to get passed down to the next generation and spread throughout the population. The evolution of this RNA editing enzyme and the mutation it fixed was not driven by natural selection, Gray argues. Instead, this extra layer of complexity evolved on its own neutrally. Then, once it became widespread, there was no way to get rid of it." End quote. In either case, however, note how the vast majority of working biologists never invoke Eros or any other mythic deity to explain complexity. Why? Because there are a whole host of much more viable and workable explanations for how a non-closed system order can emerge from chaos. Instead of a deep understanding of how chemistry evolved from physics, Wilber instead claims that Eros in action accounts for all that is new and novel in life, betraying once again any understanding of how emergence and novelty can result from simpler processes that don't need a divine being to engineer it. The chief problem, besides his misreading of how emergence works in physical systems, is how loosely Ken Wilber uses the term evolution throughout his book. He too often conflates the term to mean something akin to progress towards an omega destination, whereas biologists tend not to invoke such teleological language, since natural selection isn't a purposive force but an after-the-fact description of what can and will survive in a competing arena with the scarcity of resources. A good example of Wilber's confused use of the term is when he writes, quote, "But this is another reason that you, your thoughts, actions, feelings, communications, interactions, and behaviors can directly contribute to evolution in all four quadrants, simply by adding something new and novel that hasn't existed before. If your addition is occurring on teal or turquoise or higher, then it is open to becoming part of the very structure of that level of consciousness and complexity. You don't need to have sex and pass on some fluky genetic mutation to somebody else who also had the same fluky mutation in order to contribute to evolution. If that were so, where did all the novelty and newness come from in the universe during the millions of years before sex was invented? Atoms, after all, give rise to molecules, a massively new and novel emergent, Eros in action. And molecules gave rise to living cells, a stunning creative emergent. All without genetic mutation and natural selection, but rather in a transcend and include in mutual fit in all four quadrants. And doesn't that standard Darwinian view really mean that, for instance, today's geniuses who aren't sexually active, or those who have same-sex partners, or those whose profound mutations occur only in themselves and in nobody else, are not going to contribute to actual evolution in the slightest? Another moronic story." End quote. Here, as is usual with Wilber, he is conflating cultural evolution with biological evolution. Sex selection alters the genotype and the phenotype of future generations, whereas the thoughts and ideas we share are mimetic and are passed on in cultural fashion. Ironically, the fluky aspect here is in Wilber's garbled understanding of what Darwinian evolution suggests and what it does not. To confuse genetics with mimetics is to bastardize both. Make no mistake, Ken Wilber has a serious problem with evolution by natural selection, since it fundamentally pulls apart his integral house of cards. It is, therefore, not surprising to hear him bombastically exclaim that the simple, outrageous improbability of an evolutionary unfolding to higher and higher and higher stages of unspeakable complexity continues to defy a mere chance and natural selection explanation. End quote. What Wilber has yet to come to grips with is that higher stages of unspeakable complexity can indeed arise from simpler processes which have no intrinsic end goal in mind, since that is at the heart of what Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace co-jointly discovered back in the 1850s, and which has altered the whole course of scientific understanding to the present day. An integral theory that relies on a mythic being to explain one of the most fundamental features of the universe deserves to be lambasted. Or is moronic too kind of a description for what Wilbur tries to pass off as scientific? Chapter 12. The Books of Tomorrow, a Virtual Reality of a Living Library. I have seen and heard and touched the future of books. It happened just last night as I was playing with the family's Oculus Rift reality headset. Although we were early adopters of the VR system, it was only when I played the game Waltz of the Wizard that I saw how books could be potentially experienced 5 to 10 years hence. Let me set the scene, especially for those who have never donned an Oculus or HTC Vive headset. You enter into a fully immersive 360 room, quite reminiscent of something out of Harry Potter's world of magic, and there is a multitude of interactive options. As the official Steam download site explains, Waltz of the Wizard is a virtual reality experience that lets you feel what it's like to have magical powers. Combine arcane ingredients into a boiling cauldron with the help of an ancient spirit trapped in a human skull. Unleash creative or destructive wizardry upon a fully interactive virtual world. As my youngest son, Kelly, explained to me before I entered into the wizard's den, almost everything is interactive. The most impressive items, from chess pieces to crossbows, glowing globes to musical instruments, or chairs or illuminated swords, can all come alive depending on which spell you cast and what ingredients you put into the center cauldron. Yet what struck me so forcefully, however, was when I happened upon a book that was floating in mid-air and I reached out and grabbed it, bringing it so close that I could almost feel its binding. It looked as real as anything I have seen in graduate school at the UC Berkeley Library. Of course, I couldn't open it then and there, since it was merely a prompt, but this got me to thinking, and then I had an epiphany about the books of tomorrow. I can see in the not-so-distant future, probably sooner than I imagine, where with the latest iteration of a VR headset, one can enter a virtual library that can be designed to look like the globed and book-lined hall in Clementinum, Prague, or the huge reading room at the New York Public Library, or, better yet, Trinity College's old library in Dublin. It will be fully immersive, and one will feel the very presence of thousands of volumes. Then one can choose any book off the shelves, and as he or she opens the tome, a series of wonderful and magical options will emerge. Choose a very comfy chair and just read, or touch the page and listen to the narrator tell you its story. Or more dramatically, let the text come fully alive and fully interactive, where one can actually become part of the drama and witness all the characters as they unfold and develop via the storyline. You can even choose to be the main lead or any of the secondary characters, or, most tellingly, even the landscape itself. The book is now living, and it presents the reader with a cornucopia of alternatives, something completely unimaginable in years past. One will become the proceedings and become forever changed by the experience. Sounds like too much hype? I think not. We are merely at the threshold of what artificial intelligence and augmented reality can produce. 10 years ago, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone and Jeff Bezos the first Kindle. For better or worse, these devices and their various clones have radically transformed how humans across the globe access information. What is happening now is what I call the Great Data Seduction, where bites dress up in all sorts of fancy garb in order to entice us to partake of their offerings. And in so doing, we become entranced in worlds upon worlds of differing minefields, each offering a new vision, a new sound, a new touch, and a new way to experience what was before more or less nakedly unadorned. I remember my students at CSULB being in awe when I first showed them Amazon's Kindle in 2007, and how it could download a book within 30 seconds and hold hundreds of books in its memory. Today, this seems quaint and a bit dated since we don't even need to have hard drives to retain what we want, since the computing cloud follows us wherever we are. This reminds me anew of the comedian Stephen Wright's famous joke about how he had the largest seashell collection in the world. I have the world's largest collection of seashells. I keep it on all the beaches of the world. Perhaps you've seen it. As ironic and insightful as Wright's quip was decades ago, I never thought it could literally be true with books, and that they would be available wherever we happen to be. We now have at our fingertips not merely thousands of books, but millions of them. And we have a plethora of music, art, film, and other media at our beck and call. We live in an unprecedented time of informational overload, and thus the digital world evolves in ever-encompassing ways. Where we once simply read letters on clay tablets, on papyrus, or on thin sheets of wood pulp, in the future the book will incarnate, fully formed like an all-powerful avatar, ready to assume any form we desire, provided that it will capture our attention. Attention and time are in very short supply, and that is why virtual reality and augmented reality, even if we are Luddites who curse the postmodern age and its perpetual distractions, is our future. As Charles Dickens wrote in 1859, the same year that Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published, in A Tale of Two Cities, quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way." In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. End quote. In closing, however, I must confess that I saw in Waltz of the Wizard a magnificent future for education, where storytelling allows for unexplored vistas and voyages, where we can, and this is ironic, while sitting in our chairs, actually leave them and venture forth into Harry Potter-inspired regions, where information is no longer tethered to the limitations of pen and paper. In the future, books will fly, and with them so will we, quite literally so.